Alright. Hello, everyone. I see we already have a good number of people coming in. Can everybody hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up? Perfect. Thank you. So let me get set up. Wow. I still have a couple more minutes, so try and set up my sharing here. All right. Perfect. Thank you. And we can chat as well. That's good. It's a good sign. Oh, Said, I wasn't speaking, so I'm not sure. Can you hear me now? Sounds like others were able to. Okay, let me see. One of the attendees raised a hand. If you have any question while we're waiting for the rest, um, feel free to ask in the chat. Good. And let me just quickly take a look if I see any other of my colleagues in the group. Mhm. Let's wait for a couple more minutes because I know sometimes when people haven't used Zoom before, it may take a while to get set up. All right, so while we're waiting, how's everybody doing? Good. I hope you all had a good rest and are ready for today's session. Sometimes I'm also curious where people are joining from. So I'm based in the Czech Republic, so it's 9 a.m. for me. How about you? Can you let us know in the chat? New Zealand, Finland. Oh, okay. Wow. 8 a.m., 5 p.m. Not too bad. It's good. That's good. Awesome. I know sometimes we have people joining who are at midnight at their time. That's not the best, I guess, for this kind of technical session. But I'm glad that we can cater to a large group um, with the two webinars we're running in EMEA and in the Americas. Recognize some names in the chat as well. Awesome. Ooh, and we just hit 100 participants. Okay. India, Italy. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, I still see people flowing in, so let's wait for maybe a couple more minutes and then we'll kick things off. Vietnam, Dubai. Oh, wow. All right. What's the weather like in your countries right now? Brussels, Croatia. Oh, raining. Okay. Oh, heavy rains. Boiling. Oh, all right. Very hot. I think we're after the peak of our summer. It was really hot here a couple of weeks back, but now it's kind of cloudy and getting colder. Oh, nice. It's always funny. One of my colleagues, actually my colleague who will be presenting this session later today for the Americas time zone, he's based in Brazil, and for him, 25 is kind of cold, 25 degrees Celsius. So when I tell him it's kind of nice here, nice and warm, yeah. For Brazil, I guess 25 is kind of not really hot. Nairobi. Oh, that name I recognize. Hi, Marceline. Let me promote you to a panelist as well. In Georgia. Nice. All right, so I think we can probably start. There's still some people flowing in, but this session will be recorded anyway, so even if they miss some of the intro here, they can still um, come back, refer to it back later in the recording. All right, so let me one more time double check. And I see some folks raise their hands. If you have any questions, use the Q&A section of Zoom or the chat to ask your questions. I will explain the features of Zoom later in the presentation, but if there's anything you want to ask before we get started, ask now. I'm still monitoring the chat. Amsterdam. Ah. Mhm. All right. So I think I'm all set here. So let me start the recording and we can get started. Ta-da. Actually, okay. We're recording already. Huh. Right. So we'll need to edit that part out. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next iteration of our APS online training. This is the event where we developer advocates from Autodesk um, live code typically through one of our own tutorials that we have available online. And we do this for people who, instead of reading through the tutorials by themselves, people who prefer to follow somebody else going through these tutorials. And This week, this online training this week is dedicated to the topic of low code, no code. So basically, not necessarily immediately being able to use our APIs without knowing how to code, but it's more about looking at some of the existing low code, no code systems and platforms out there and showing you how you could potentially build connections with these low code, no code systems or integrations with our platform, with Autodesk Platform Services. Right. And I see we already have one question in the Q&A. Will GraphQL queries in Postman be covered in the session? Not today, not today. So Postman, the tool that we'll be using today, I'll explain what it can do, what it's about. You can use it to explore and manage and test your APIs, whether it's REST APIs, GraphQL APIs, MQTT protocol, WebSockets, and whatnot. But today, really, the focus will be on the low-code, no-code capabilities of Postman. And yes, this session will be recorded and shared with all of the attendees after the event. And I'll also repeat that one more time. We have that note in the slides as well. All right. So for me, my name is Peter Bras. I'm one of the developer advocates here at Autodesk. In my case, I focused on the platform itself, on Autodesk Platform Services. And I'm also joined here by a couple of my colleagues who I invited as panelists. And by the way, if there's anybody else I missed in the long list of attendees, let me know and I'll promote you to panelist as well so that these folks will be helping me today answering your questions in the chat or in the Q&A as I'm presenting. And if we see some, I don't know, an issue that more people are struggling with, we can always pause and I can address it myself um, as well. And I see Adam here. Perfect. Thank you. Great. So the format of the events, the same as usual. And again, maybe some of you have already attended one of our online trainings before. The format will be the same, just the topic this week will be different. It will be focused on the low code, no code platforms and systems. This week, the event will run over 3 days, where, as usual, each day will be dedicated to a different topic. And we will run the webinars twice every day, once for our EMEA audience and once for our America's time zone audience. The idea, once again, of this webinar is that instead of you having to go through one of our public tutorials on your own, you will follow us. We will basically go through our own tutorial. You will be following our steps. And if you have any questions, whenever you get stuck on anything or something is not clear, you can ask us in either the chat or in the Q&A section that you should see on your Zoom toolbar. And again, either myself or one of my colleagues here will try and unblock you so that you can follow along. And let me bring in Deepali as well, one more colleague of mine who will be helping us today. Let me just quickly scan through the attendee list.
And Caro too.
Yeah, perfect. All right. And one more time, just reiterating because I know we always get this question, so we want to make sure you all know. This session is being recorded and it will be made available to all of you after the event. So if you miss some part of our webinar today, don't worry. If you need to leave earlier, don't worry. I think it's always better to, try and stick with us, follow our flow. But if you need to leave or you miss a part, don't worry about that. The full tutorial is always available online, and the recording will also be made available to you after the event. Okay,
Yeah,
so the
hi
first
Peter.
topic of our event this week is Postman flows specifically. So Postman is a very popular platform for API management where you can design APIs, explore and test your APIs. Um, but there's this one feature, this one part of this product that maybe many people do not know about, and it is called Postman flows. And this is basically a visual based low code, no code programming where you can chain the different API calls that you managed in your Postman collections, where you can chain them together and you can include loops and conditionals. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to show you how, if you happen to be using Postman already, or if you're maybe considering getting Postman as your main API management tool, I want to show you how you could potentially use it to actually build very nice automations where you could, again, chain different API calls to our platform together to achieve certain automated workflows. All right, let me see. I have one more colleague. Caroline. Sorry, I thought I promoted you. All right. So that will be the topic of our webinar today, Postman flows. This is the final outcome. This is something that we'll try and build today. Again, some of you who know Postman already might be familiar with the user interface. Those of you who are new to Postman, don't worry, I'll go over it as well. But this is basically this example flow, as it's called in the Postman terminology, will build a simple automation, sort of you can think of it as a script just by assembling a bunch of these building blocks together that will basically generate a storage report for all the individual buckets in our OSS service in our platform. So OSS is the Object Simple Storage Service. That's one part of our platform where you can create your own storage and upload your design files and manage them there. Um, and I see that there's a question also in the chat. Are there other options to manage APIs rather than Postman? Absolutely. There's plenty. There's plenty of API or HTTP clients out there. Another very popular one that some of my colleagues have been using is called Insomnia. There's also what was it called? The Thunder Rest, I think, or it was a name, something like that. There's plenty. We picked Postman specifically because of the flows feature. So again, just know you're not limited to just Postman if you want to start managing your own APIs. But today we're looking at Postman because of the flows feature. This feature is not very common in other clients. I don't think that something like Insomnia, for example, provides this type of functionality. So that's why we picked Postman, and that's why we're going to be using it today. All right. Let me also copy. I hope I can. Can I? No. Let me just grab the link to the tutorial here and share it in the chat. So I pasted a link in the chat. This is the actual tutorial that I will be following today. And again, keep it, keep it on the side just in case, again, you want to maybe revisit this tutorial later, or you want to maybe, I don't know, try it yourself also at some point. Um, you can just save the link for later. And yeah, this is the idea. This is the outcome that we want to get to. So again, having this kind of an automation workflow that will go through all of our buckets in our OSS service. Buckets are really just kind of like you can think of them as folders where you can store your design data. And it will scan through all of them and it will get the size of all the designs or all the files in the individual buckets, and it will generate this nice bar chart showing you how much storage is used by your files in your individual buckets. So in my case here, you can see I already have a good number, some, I don't know, maybe 20 or 25 buckets. And here I can use it to very quickly get some idea of like, how much storage I'm using in the individual buckets. All right. Also, what we typically do with these kind of webinars is we split them into a couple of sessions with some breaks in between. And that's so that, if somebody needs a little bit more time to catch up, they can do that. Or if somebody wants to take a quick break, get some coffee or tea, that's also possible. So when you take a look at the tutorial the link I sent you, the tutorial is split into four parts: the setup and buckets flow module, objects flow module, and example flow. And we will basically be following these four parts of the tutorial as our sessions here, and we will be taking breaks in between those. And one thing I want to clarify here is there's no specific schedule for the individual parts or the breaks. We let you decide. So if you want to go faster, we can. If you want to take a longer break, we can do that as well. So at the end of every part, we will run a poll in Zoom where you can let us know how much of a break, how long of a break you want to take, and based on that, we can then um, all and get some coffee and then come back at the agreed time. All right. So let me do one more thing here. I still see more people coming in. I'm just gonna capture a screenshot here. Those of you who joined us later, I'll just repeat what I mentioned earlier. Don't worry if you missed the beginning. All these sessions, all these webinars are being recorded and the recordings will be made available to all of you. All right, so let's start with the prerequisites. What you'll need for our webinar today, first of all, is some kind of APS application. Um, and if you don't know what that means, an APS application is really just a set of credentials you can generate on our developer portal. So when you go to aps.autodesk.com, this is our developer portal for our platform. If you don't have an account yet, you can sign up and get a free trial subscription. And once you're logged in, let me log in here. Let me log in myself. After logging in, you will be able to access this section called My Applications. This is where you can, again, create these apps, but you're not necessarily creating applications, but rather you're creating um, sort of like a username and password for your app that you can then use when calling the different APIs, as we will do from Postman. So if you don't have an account, please go ahead and create one. You can get, again, a free trial subscription, and create, if you don't have an application, go ahead and create one. So here, for example, if I create an application, I'm going to call it, let's say, low code, no code, online training 2025. I will select the traditional web app and hit create. This will basically generate these credentials for me. So they're in the proper terminology, they're called client ID and client secret. So you want to have an application with these kinds of credentials because these we will later configure in Postman so that Postman can start talking to the Autodesk Platform Services on behalf of your specific application here. So this application will have its own buckets, its own access, to its own data in our platform. It won't be able to see other applications content, for example. All right, let's see. Okay. Um, Another thing you'll need, of course, is Postman. Postman, I think, was started as a web application, but later was made available as a desktop application as well. So if you don't have Postman, simply go to postman.com, and here you'll be able to download a desktop client, hopefully, although here I'm already signed in. Not sure if I can see it here. Here, yeah. So if you're already, so you also need to create an account with Postman, I believe. That one is also free. I mean, there's a free tier that is sufficient for what we're going to be doing today. The flows is specifically, I think there is a limit of 50 flow runs per month. So again, feel free, create an account if you don't have one. You can just keep the free tier because the flows are available there as well. And here, basically, when I go to postman.com in my browser, I'm already logged in. So I see the web version of the client, but what I recommend you do is in the bottom left side here, hit the download desktop app um, link. So you'll basically be able to run the same experience as a desktop application as I already do here. So you can see here is the same kind of UI. This is a desktop application where you can start managing your collections of requests, environments, and I'll explain what those are, as well as flows. And here you can see in my case, because I'm on the free plan, it tells me I have 48 out of 50 free runs remaining on the free plan. So make sure you can run the flows again. Um, I hope there won't be any special cases. I believe that, again, everybody should have access to those 50 free flow runs uh, a month on their free plan. And by the way, if you don't see these flows or other buttons in the sidebar, you can configure them in here, I believe. Oh, there you go. So when you use this button at the very bottom that says Configure Workspace Sidebar, you can decide which components of Postman you want to see in the sidebar. So if you don't see flows there, simply check the checkbox next to it. All right. Do you have the links to set all this up? To set up, I mean, there are no links to create an application, I don't think. That's simply, again, a matter of going to, this My Application section on the developer portal and creating an app. And if you want a link for Postman, that's simply postman.com. All right. Now, the first part, so hopefully everybody has their application credentials in our platform, the client ID and client secret, and everybody has their Postman running. So the first steps we'll take the first part of our webinar today is we're gonna start creating API requests or collections of API requests in Postman. Um, Now we could do this by hand, and for that, let me go back to my Postman here. We could go to collections. This is the default area where you can start creating your requests. Here, if I hit new button at the top, you can see whether, if I wanted to create an HTTP endpoint, a GraphQL, MCP, gRPC, WebSocket endpoint, I could do all of that. Um, we will be creating REST API endpoints for our object storage service, object simple storage service. So that service uses something called REST APIs. So we could manually start creating HTTP APIs in our collections in Postman, but we don't have to do that. And the reason for that is we have recently published something called Open API specifications for some of our services. And these Open API specifications are basically YAML files that precisely describe the individual API endpoints, how the URLs look like, what kind of parameters are in the URL, what kind of query parameters can be included, what kind of headers can be set for these API calls. And the Open API specifications also describe the shape of the requests and the responses you can get back when calling these APIs. So it already does a lot of the setup for us. So instead of creating, these APIs for listing buckets or creating buckets or listing objects or uploading files to a bucket, instead of defining these by hand, we can actually create these specs. We can actually import these Open API specs into Postman, and Postman will generate these API collections for us automatically. So in order to do that, if you go back to the tutorial website, and we are currently at part one, setup. You will see I've already included a link to our GitHub repo that points to the OpenAPI specification for our storage service, for the OSS service. Let me paste it in the chat. This is the OpenAPI specification for object simple storage service. Let me also open it here to show you. If you simply follow the link, this is the YAML file. Let me make it bigger. This is the YAML file that describes our object storage service and its API. So there is API such as /OSS/v2/buckets. This is an endpoint you can call in our service. It supports a get method, and here we can see where the specification is defining what kinds of parameters the API endpoint accepts, what kind of responses you could expect when calling it. So you could expect a 200 OK response if everything worked well, and you receive a list of buckets with a certain shape or a schema. So here we include a definition of what the response will look like, what the JSON will look like. You can also get 400 or 401 if you're not authorized. So all this, including all the authentication, what kind of scopes are needed. Everything is described for every single API endpoint of your service. Everything is described here, captured in this Open API spec in this YAML file. So what we'll do is we'll go to Postman, and instead of hitting this new button and start creating the APIs by hand, we will say import. And at the top here, you can paste either a complete OpenAPI YAML definition, or you can paste a link to a YAML file like the one I shared with you in the chat. So if I paste my OpenAPI spec link in this field at the top, we're already importing our specification into Postman. One thing, so we can keep the Postman collection checked here. So we will create a new collection with all the requests from the OpenAPI spec. And I also want to ask you to, so that we're all on the same on the same page to hit this view import settings link and set a couple of things here. Um, Naming requests we can keep to fallback. Indentation is not important. Parameter generation we want to keep to set to schema, not to example, because the schema itself already defines all the parameters. Um, Folder organization, again, to make sure that you can follow what I'm doing here, make sure to set this to tags. So that means that all the requests that are imported into Postman will be structured into folders based on something called tags. Here, when I look back at the YAML file, you can see that each of the endpoints has its own tag or set of tags. So these are kind of like sort of like labels you can attach like categories so that you can categorize the individual APIs. In this case, you can see that, let's say, this endpoint for listing buckets, we attached a tag that we decided to call buckets to put it in a category called buckets. And with these tags, if you set the folder organization in Postman to tags, that means that um, all the imported requests will be put into subfolders based on the tag. So they'll be nicely categorized in a buckets folder or an objects folder. Okay. And one more thing, auth info and example request, we can keep that enabled. But one thing also, make sure to disable this option that says enable optional parameters. We don't, for now, we don't want to make the optional parameters enabled by default. We want to keep them disabled and only enable the ones that we actually want. So I would recommend that you disable this optional parameters so that they remain toggled off. All right. And inherit authentication always. It's also something we want to enable. I'll explain what that means in a second. All right. So with these settings, if I hit import, you'll see that we're now importing our spec and we're done. So now I have a new folder here, new collection called OSS. And inside the collection, I have some folder structure. And again, like since we chose the structure, create folder structure based on tags, we really only have two folders, buckets and objects, because these are the tags we used in our OpenAPI specification. All right. So now we can see we already have a nice list of APIs we can call in our object simple storage service. Operations such as getting a list of buckets, creating a new bucket, deleting a bucket, listing all objects in a bucket, creating, or deleting an object or generating a signed URL, which is something we could later use to actually upload files to our storage buckets. All right. Let me pause for a second. I see there was a question. So anybody is having issues creating APS applications? I hope that's not the case. Don't see anything in Q&A, so it sounds like we should be good. All right, perfect. So everybody has been able to import the OpenAPI spec into Postman. Everybody has their OSS collection available now. Perfect. Yeah, please give me thumbs up if you're all set. Just to get an idea. All right. So this looks good. Awesome. All right. Now we can do one more thing. This we can rename our collection because it doesn't at this point. Oh, how to import again? In Postman, at the top left, when you open the collections sidebar, you should see these two buttons called New and Import. New is used to actually manually create new folders, new API requests, new flows, whatever. Or in our case, we want to import from the YAML file link I shared with you guys in the chat earlier. So you want to hit the import button and paste the link in here. This will help you. This will let you import all the requests from an Open API specification. But again, there's some settings you want to follow when importing. And I described them a moment ago, but you can find them also in here. Let me point you to. Yeah, thank you, Pedro. So Pedro shared the link to for the import step, which in the tutorial where we describe the settings you want to set when doing the import. All right. So one more thing we can do, we can select when we click the OSS collection here, we basically open the collection page. So this is the definition of our Postman collection where you can set certain things, configure things for the collection itself. One minor thing we can do here is simply by clicking this OSS title at the top, we can rename it to something like Object Storage Service. This is just to make it nicely more legible. Because later when you have more collections, more folders, it's better to keep things organized. All right, so this is our collection. You can see it even brought in some description of the service itself from the OpenAPI spec. So this information is coming from the YAML file as well. All right. Next part is we will create something called an environment in Postman. And where this is helpful is imagine that all the API calls that you will want to start, all the APIs that you will want to start calling eventually will need some sort of authentication, right? Like remember earlier we wanted to create our APS application with its client ID, client secret. These are the credentials that we will somehow need to use to authenticate our calls to these APIs. It would be very repetitive if we had to set up the same authentication and copy paste the same credentials over and over again for every single endpoint, right? And we don't want to do that. And that's why Postman, just like the other uh, HTTP clients like Insomnia, they provide this concept of environments where, as part of an environment, you can define certain variables and you can then reuse these variables in different API requests. So let's say here we can create an environment where we will define our client ID and client secret. We can save them here once, and then later we can use a special syntax in our API calls to reuse the same variables in many, many places. And later, when we want to change, let's say the client ID and the client secret, we don't need to go through every single API request and modify it by hand. We can simply modify the environment and all the API requests will still work with this new updated environment. Okay, so in order to do that, switch to the environment sidebar in Postman and hit this create environment link. Okay, so now we've created a new environment. We can give it a name. I'm going to call it, I don't know, test env. Later, you could potentially create multiple environments. So imagine you could have one for production, one for staging, or you could have, let's say you are creating different APS applications for different customers or for different teams within your company. You could have these different environments configured in Postman, and then you can very easily toggle between them. I'll show you how to do that. Okay. Now, what we'll want to do is we'll want to add two variables in our environment. We're going to call them APS underscore client underscore ID. And we're going to keep it a default type. And we're going to create one more variable and call it APS underscore client, come on, underscore secret. This is how we typically name the variables where we store the client ID and client secret of our APS applications. One more thing I'm going to do here is for the client secret, I'm going to change the type to secret. What this means is that any kind of value I will set to these variables will not be visible. It'll be protected so that I'm not sharing my client secret with everybody watching the recording of this webinar. All right. So let's grab our client ID and client secret and set them here. Um, Variable names, case sensitive. That's a really good question. I'm not sure right now if the variables in Postman are case sensitive. I can try that later. I'll let you know because just in a second we'll be using these the special syntax to use these variables in our request. So I'll try that and I'll see if what the case sensitivity looks like. But for now, let's go back to our APS application. Let's say this one I created here. I'm gonna copy a client ID and paste it in the initial value. And the same for client secret. I'm gonna copy the client secret for my app. I'm gonna paste it here. Okay. And now I can hit the save button in the top right corner and my environment has been created. Um, Now, if I want to start using the environment, I wouldn't be able to do it just yet, and that is because I haven't selected the environment. And you select environments using this drop down in the top right corner. So you can see here right now it says no environment, but I can use the drop down to toggle to the test environment that I just created. Okay, and again, imagine in future, you might have dozens and dozens of environments that you can just toggle between very easily here. And all your requests that will use this special syntax with the curly braces that I will explain in a second will still work. It will just the request will then interpolate with the new values from the environment that you just activated. So again, creating environments simply go to the environments sidebar here, environments. And if you don't have any environment, you will see a link called create environment. When you click that link, you'll be presented with this page representing your environment where you can start creating variables. And I would ask you create two variables for now, one called APS client ID and one called APS client secret. Set the client secrets to the type secret so that the value is actually not displayed anywhere in the UI. And copy paste your client ID and client secret from the Autodesk Developer Portal. And actually, while I'm here, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, instead of using this new set of credentials for myself, I'm going to use one of the applications that I created in the past because I already have some existing content there. So I'm going to configure client ID. I'm going to set the client secret as well. Uh, Petya already answered. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was thinking that would probably be the case, but we can try that here as well. If I wanted to do something like, let's say, set my region to APS client ID, and if I used, yeah, so this is something I was going to show you in a second. This is the syntax that Postman specifically uses for interpolating the values of your environments. So if I just use APS client ID on lowercase, you see it's red. It's telling me it doesn't recognize this particular environment variable. But if I say APS, and you see I even get IntelliSense here, client ID uppercase, this value gets colored blue, and you can actually see this is the value I configured in my environment for this particular variable name, APS client ID. So yes, Petyo is right. It's case sensitive. Okay, so we have our test environment. I hope everybody has been able to create theirs. You have your APS client ID and APS client secret set up. And next part is configuring authorization for our requests that we imported into Postman. So again, as I mentioned earlier, every API request that you have here will need to have some sort of authentication. It will, because you can't just simply call an API in our platform without providing some information about who you are, right? We use a popular auth standard called OAuth 2.0, which uses token-based authentication system, which means that whenever you want to call our APIs, you will first need to call a special endpoint in our authorization service. We will generate a temporary token for you, which is like a very long string. And you will then need to include this string, this token, in any API call you're making, whether it's to our data management service, to our model derivative service, or whatever other service we have available in our platform. So it's called OAuth. And luckily for us, in Postman, you can configure different types of authentications for your request, including OAuth as well. Now, the interesting part is, let's say I select this list buckets request here. I could either, you can see here, after selecting the request, I have a couple of tabs here I can toggle between. I have parameters. This is where I control the parameters that I want to maybe include with my API call. These query parameters means basically anything after a question mark in the URL. I can also configure headers that I want to include with my request. All these have been also imported from the OpenAPI spec from the YAML file. I can, in certain cases, configure the body of the request that I want to that I want to send with the API call, and I can set up some scripting and settings here as well. The important part is authorization. This is where I could, if I wanted to, potentially configure authentication for this list buckets request only. But I don't want to do that for every single request because, as you can see here, by default, we say the authentication is inherited from parent. So I could actually go to the folder level and I could configure the authorization at the folder level. So then, whatever authentication or authorization I set up here would be immediately inherited by all these four API requests. And similarly, I can go to not to the folder, but to the entire collection, and I can configure authorization at the collection level, in which case, whatever setup I create here will immediately be inherited and available to all these requests. So that's what we're going to do now. All right, so I'm gonna select the object storage service collection. So I'm gonna toggle to the authorization tab, and here I'll configure. We will configure the authentication for all our OSS requests. You can see Postman supports basic auth, JWT bearer, digest auth, API keys, and whatnot. And as I mentioned earlier, our platform uses the OAuth 2.0 standard. So pick OAuth 2.0. And next, what we want to do is add auth data to, we can keep that to request headers. Um, Current token right now, probably don't see any tokens. There is actually, I do see one, but this one is outdated, so let me delete it. So this is what you should see when you open the dropdown, the token dropdown. No tokens available. Okay. So right now there's no token just yet. We can configure one. And the way to do that is we can scroll down to the section called configure new token. We can give it a name. So I'm going to call it, let's say APS client credentials. You can pick whatever name you want. This is just a name that you will see your tokens under. Um, Now, grant type, this is, OAuth. The OAuth standard has different ways of generating these tokens. There is a flow called authorization code, which typically involves people logging in with their credentials. But for today, since we're working with the object simple storage service, which works simply with your application, not with a specific user of your application, we will choose the grant type client credentials. This is a simpler version of an OAuth flow where you simply set your client ID, client secret to our authorization service, and we just get you back immediately a token that represents your entire application, not a specific user. And this is the token that our object simple story service expects. All right, so access token URL. So we need to tell Postman what API it should call when it wants to generate a token. If we go back to the tutorials, we are now at the setup authorization. We can simply grab this link. This is basically, you would find this in our documentation, but I'm including it in the tutorial. And let me paste the API endpoint in the chat as well. This is the endpoint of our authorization service that can be used to generate a token for your given credentials. Okay, so we can paste the token URL here. And now we need to specify, of course, the client ID and client secret. And again, we don't want to hard code them here because then it means like every time we want to change an environment, we would need to come back here and update these values manually. So instead, I will type in two opening curly braces. And when I do that, Postman is already telling me what variables I have available to me at this moment. And you can see there is one with a C. This means that there is some kind of a variable defined at the collection level. And then I have these two, APS client ID and client secret, with this green E icon indicating that these variables are defined in the environment. Because even variables can be defined at different scopes. They can be defined at the folder or like a global level, collection level, or environment level, I believe. So what I can do is, in this case, I can simply click the APS client ID, and similarly for client secret, I can pick the APS client secret. And what this means is that instead of having to manually type in hard code client ID and client secret into my authorization setup, this will automatically pick the values for client ID and client secret from whatever environment I currently have active. Okay. And going back to our tutorial, we will also need to define a scope. And in the OAuth standard, scope basically means the types of operations you want to enable for that given token. So when generating a token, you can specify that the token is only allowed to make certain types of operations. Okay. So in this case, we can grab this. Let me again paste the string in the chat. These are the scopes that we want to enable for our tokens. So bucket, colon, read. And again, these are all described in our documentation. Here, we're basically saying any token we generate with these scopes will be able to read buckets, create buckets, read files in those buckets, and create and upload files to the buckets. All right. So let me paste the scopes here, and the rest, I believe, can be left in default values. And when you then scroll to the very bottom, there's a button that's called Get New Access Token. Now it should ideally tell you, hopefully, that authentication is complete. You see this new access token that has been generated for me. It has a limited time to live. That's one of the inherent properties of access tokens. So I can hit use token. And now if I scroll back up to the current token, you can see that Postman has now selected this one token that I called APS client credentials. So this one will now be available for every request in this collection. And here you can see it says that the token will expire at 10:54 a.m. my time, which means 1 hour from now. So in this case, is valid for 1 hour. Later, we would either need to manually refresh it, so call this authorization API to generate a new token, or we can actually here, this is another nice feature of Postman, we can check this auto refresh token option. And this basically means in the future, let's say 2 hours from now, if we want to make call an API request and Postman detects that the token we have configured at the collection level is expired, it will automatically call this endpoint for us again to create a fresh version of it. So let me save the authorization. And with this, this token will now be automatically used by all our requests. And I see we have uh, somebody struggling with an issue um, in the chat. And also, let me see Q&A. So people can't find the variable. So if you're trying to use the variables like APS underscore clan ID and you don't see them in the suggestions, make sure you actually selected the test environment in the top right corner, right? Because if I switch to no environment, you can see that now all these are colored red because Postman can't find these variables anywhere. It can't find them in any environment. It can't find them in any collection. It can't find these variables defined at the global level either. So make sure you select the test environment. Now you see these are now blue and Postman is able to grab these values. Um, Now, maybe one more thing also to check when you were creating the environment, when you defined your variables, make sure that you actually saved the environment. Okay. So again, make sure also that you don't have any extra spaces before or after the the strings that you're setting as the values for your environment variables. Okay, save. Yeah, so make sure to save your environment and then you can close it and make sure you select the environment in the drop down in the top right corner. All right, there's one more question. Will refresh work for both two-legged and three-legged? No. Postman does support both, but in this case, the way we've configured the authorization here, since we set the grant type to client credentials, this authorization setup only works for two-legged. But you're actually right. Imagine that you import another collection, let's say of your, I don't know, ACC issues APIs. You could configure the authorization for your ACC issues APIs to use not client credentials, but authorization code. And in that case, yes, you can actually set up Postman so that when you want to create a new access token, it will pop up a browser window where you can log in with your audited credentials, and it will generate a three-legged token, and it will also be able to refresh that three-legged token for you, right? So, but these are like two different configurations. We use the two-legged token configuration because that's what we need for the object storage service. All right. So with that, with the authorization setup, hopefully, let me try. Like so now, if I go in my case, let's say I go to list buckets. You see, when I look at the authorization tab of my list buckets request, the auth is still configured to be inherited from parent. So you can see that now we're actually seeing this token that's going to be used for my request that's coming from the collection where we configured authorization. So if I now simply, let me check, if I simply hit the send button, I should get a list of my buckets, right? So in this case, again, I see you may see an empty list, but here, since I actually configured Postman with my existing APS application credentials, where I already have plenty of buckets, I'm already seeing some results coming back from the API call. In this case, I see a bunch of buckets and something here. You can see this field next, indicating that there's actually more, but this API uses what we call pagination. So instead of giving you a potentially a very large JSON with all the content, it gives you the first page and it then gives you a link to follow to go to the next pages, to go through the next pages. All right. So I see there are some people are having issues with the authentication. Um, thank you, Pedro. So Pedro shared the the scopes that you should configure for your auth. Again, that's when you go to the scope. And again, make sure there's no weird characters in there. It should really be a bunch of these, key value pairs separated by space, right? So I have bucket colon read, then bucket colon create, data colon read, data colon write, and they're just separated by space. And make sure there's no weird characters before or after. Um, got it working, perfect. Um, I see. Okay, Ahmed, you're jumping ahead. You're trying to create new buckets, it looks like. We'll get to that. Is it possible to maximize your Postman desktop screen? Okay, I'm not sure because it's still going to be tiny, but I think am I going to be able to? Okay, how about this? Yeah, I can increase the font size in Postman. Yeah, I should have done that at the beginning. All right, perfect. Cool. So we have our authentication set up. So again, I can now do things like list buckets or create buckets. That's something we're going to try next. So we're getting towards the end of our first session. So we have our collection of requests imported into Postman from our OpenAPI specs. We configured our environment with the client ID and client secret credentials. We configured the authorization for all of our imported requests, right, at the collection level. And we can now try and see if we can, okay, let's say create an OSS bucket. For that, let me switch back to the tutorial to try it out section. We want to create a bucket. Now, let me explain. There might be some tweaks we may need to do in Postman. So if we select the create bucket endpoint, you can see that, sorry, not list buckets, create bucket. There you go. You can see in this case, when creating a bucket, we see this green circle next to body, meaning that in this case, this is a post request. And with post requests, you typically need to include some payload because your post requests are typically used for creating some kind of resource. And in this case, we want to create a new bucket. So first of all, what we'll need to specify is a bucket key. And I see this may be the issue that Adam already helped answer in the chat. Um, we also explained that in the tutorial, so you can always refer to it later. Um, there are certain restrictions on the bucket keys or bucket names. First of all, it has to be globally unique. Just like in Amazon's S3, where you can create buckets, they have to be globally unique. The same applies here. So if you simply try and create a bucket called test, you will very likely get an error, something like 409, because um, that bucket is already created and owned by another APS application, client ID and client secret. And there's also the length of the bucket name must be between 3 and 128 characters, and it must only consist of these characters, underscores, dashes, dots, lowercase characters, and numbers, right? So no uppercase characters, as Adam mentioned. I can try and intentionally use some weird um, bucket name to see how it fails, actually. Now, for the rest, policy key is also relatively useful. And you can see we're getting this nice um, help from the imported OpenAPI spec. The policy key basically is used to configure the data retention policy for the bucket. And we currently support three options. Persistent means that any data you upload to the bucket will remain there until you decide to delete it yourself. Temporary means that any data you upload to your bucket will automatically be removed after 30 days. And transient means that any object or any data you upload to your bucket will be automatically removed for after 24 hours. So for now, we can say, let's say persistent, and the rest allow, we can delete this. This is an optional part of the request. This is where you could potentially make your bucket accessible to other client IDs as well. But in this case, we don't need that. So our payload will look simply like this, bucket key and policy key. Okay, and again, you can even hover the fields of the JSON to get this nice tooltip help from the OpenAPI spec descriptions. Now, let me save my request, but I expect that it will fail. There you go. We got a 400 bad request, and it's, the object simple storage service is telling us, yeah, the bucket key you provided is incorrect. It must only consist of these characters. It must be between 3 and 128 characters long. So what I could do is I could say maybe heater, low code, no code, bucket. Save my request, and now perfect. I got a 200 OK response indicating that this bucket was created. Yeah, Salvo, in the chat, I see you get when if you get an error 409 with the reason bucket already exists, you're basically trying to create a bucket that somebody else already created. Like I mentioned, yeah, bucket underscore one would be an example. I'm sure some people before already created a bucket with this name. And since bucket names must be globally unique, if you try and create one with the same name, you will get this error. So try and maybe prefix it with your name. So it could be like, let's say, salvo underscore bucket underscore one. That should probably be uh, free to use still. Okay. All right. So we've been able to create a new bucket. Um, Now what we can do is, let me see. Next one, we wanted to list OSS buckets. Again, so I already tried that before. So I can close my create bucket request. I can go back to my list buckets request. And if I hit send, you'll see that again, I get a bunch of buckets I already created in the past. And if I wanted to, I could also grab this link and basically follow it to go through the next pages. Okay. Shakti, yes. So buckets are created, they are associated and owned by your specific APS account. That is correct. But the reason they have to be unique globally is because these buckets that we're creating here are actually the exact same buckets in S3 in Amazon. In Amazon Web Services, S3, when you create a bucket, um, it has to be globally unique as well. So that's why, because we're basically using the standard S3 buckets from Amazon, which have to be globally unique. That's why our buckets are required to be globally unique as well. Ahmed, I see unable to parse JSON. That there could be an issue with when you're creating a bucket. There could be some malformed something wrong with your JSON. So maybe you kept an extra comma there. You should see these red squiggly lines indicating that something is wrong with the JSON. Like if I do this again, like Postman will scream at me with the squiggly lines. If I try and beautify, well, that actually works. But yeah, pay attention to like any weird characters because this is not a valid JSON, right? This comma at the end. This works in JavaScript, but not in JSON. Yeah, and if you're getting this error, Ahmed, that means that again, you're using some characters that are not allowed in the bucket key. It must only be lowercase letters, numbers, underscores, dots, and dashes. Can I share the bucket with anyone without token? No, no, not the bucket itself. There is a way to generate a temporary signed URL for a specific file in your bucket that you can share with others, but not the bucket itself. All right. So we've created our bucket. Now we can upload an object. So this one requires two steps or two steps because that's actually related to what you were asking, Mahmoud. Um, in order to upload an object to one of our buckets, we first need to generate something called a signed URL, which is a temporary URL that gives you access to a specific resource, even with even write enabled. And then you can use this temporary generated URL to actually upload our file to it. So what we'll do is, let me see, let me make sure. Ba-bum. Listing buckets, uploading files. Yeah. So we're going to generate the signed URL. Here you can see, looking at the parameters of the generate signed URL request, there is a bunch of parameters you could include with your call. These are disabled by default. That's how we configured. Let me see. Ahmed, you're using angle brackets, and these are not allowed. See, in your bucket key, you're using the opening angle bracket and the closing angle bracket, and these are not allowed characters. That's why you're getting the error. So these are disabled by default because they're optional. Um, but I can enable access here. And when I do that, you can notice how it immediately adds this question mark access equals read write, right? So we're enabling this optional query parameter. So query parameters are all the parameters that appear after the question mark in the URL. So here, this is where we can decide what type of access the temporary URL should have, right? So we can say we want to generate a URL that is read-only, or we generate a URL that has read-write access. Um, we keep that here. Now, we also need to specify the bucket where the object should be uploaded to and the name of the object within the bucket that should be created after we upload the actual file. Now, you can see here, these are marked with the red asterisk, meaning that these are required, and that's because these are path variables. So bucket key, object key, and you can find them in the URL in the path because they start with a colon. So you see here, colon bucket key, colon object key. These are variables of the path, and these have to be provided. We need to provide some value instead of this bucket key and object key. Here, some weird values got in with from the Open API spec. We want to change that, right? So here we want to use the bucket name, I guess the bucket that we created a moment ago. So now what was the name of the bucket I was creating? Or maybe I'll just use one of those, one of the existing ones. So if I go back to my list buckets request, I can just grab one of the, let's say, one of these buckets that I own. So one here I called remove me bucket. I can either just copy paste it manually, or I can actually use variables as well. So if I select the string without the double quotes, I can right click it and I can say set as variable. And here I can decide to either save it to one of the existing variables or create a new one. So I'm going to say create a new one. I'm going to call it bucket key. And I'm going to define it at the, let's say, collection level. You could do that. So here, when I go back to my request for generating a signed URL, I can use the curly braces, and you can see that now I have this other variable available here called bucket key. So instead of hard coding a specific bucket name, I mean, I could do that as well, but for now, I'm just gonna use this variable here. And we also need to define the name of the object that will be uploaded to the bucket. How did I create the variable? Again, when I was listing my buckets, I selected one of the buckets. I selected just the name without the double quotes, right clicked, and I used the set as variable. So that's something you can do quite nicely. So here, you can just select a piece of text from the response you get from the API call. And you can right click and say set as variable. And you can either save it to one of the existing variables, or you can create a new one. So I use this set as new variable, and I created a new one called bucket key and saved it at the collection level. That's why you see the C here. And we can actually, if I go to the collection, the object storage service, there is a section called variables. So you can see that it got automatically stored in here at the collection level. All right. So again, before we create the signed URL, we also need to de decide on the name of the object that will be created in the bucket after we upload the actual data to it. So for now, I'm just going to grab one of the official Revit sample files. So I'm just going to call it something like test RVT. All right. So again, if you want to upload a different kind of file, maybe you want to use a different kind of extension, file extension. Here, I'm just going to grab one of the official Revit samples and upload that file there. By the way, we also mentioned that in the tutorial up in the upload file section. We provide a link to the official Revit samples. Let me paste it in the chat. So here, when you follow that link, you can just pick one Revit file here and just use that for your experiments if you don't want to use any files of your own. So I already have a bunch of these downloaded to my local system, so I'm just going to use them from there. All right. Also, before we create a signed URL, let's also take a look at the body here, because again, you see the green circle here indicating that some body request is actually set. In this case, a JSON is required with some additional optional parameters, one called minutes expiration and one called single use. These are both optional, so we can delete them, but you can hover over them to see what they do, right? So minutes expiration, this value you can use to define the expiration time for the URL itself, for the signed URL. By default, it expires after 2 minutes, but you can choose anything between 1 and 60 minutes. And single use means that this URL will only be allowed to be called once. So if you create this signed URL, when somebody, let's say, reads from it, um, then any subsequent attempts to read from that URL will no longer work. But again, these are both optional and we don't really need to configure these. So I'm just gonna delete the fields and just keep the curly braces, this empty JSON object. Right? Now, when I hit the send button, I should get a temporary signed URL here. See, this is our signed URL that is now valid for 2 minutes. So I now have 2 minutes to upload a file to this URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the URL. I'm going to create a new request in Postman, and I'm going to paste the temporary signed URL in here. And these are typically put requests. So when you want to upload some file, you typically use put method for that. So simply paste the signed URL in a new request and change the method to put. And now what we'll need to do is go to body, because here we actually need to include the file we're trying to upload. I can specify binary, and with that, Postman will let me pick a file from my local machine. So I'm going to hit the select file, new file from local machine, and I can go to my Revit designs and grab one. Let's say, I don't know, RAC basic sample project. Open. Now my request is ready, and now if I hit send, it will take a while because the Revit file is 15 megabytes or something. But now you see that I got the 200 OK response. So now I've successfully uploaded my Revit design file to the remove me bucket. It has certain size, so 19 megabytes actually. And now this object is available in my OSS bucket. And I can confirm that by going to the list objects request, which is supposed to list all the objects in a specific bucket. And in here, again, I want to list objects from my temporary bucket I created for this experiment. So if I use my double curly brackets, I can, again, instead of hard coding the bucket name itself, I can just use the variable because this is the same bucket I generated the temporary signed URL for. All right. So if I hit save and I say list objects, you can see that now there is a single item in my bucket and it's the test RVT file that I just uploaded. Okay, so let me repeat that one more time. I see some people missed that part um, of uploading files. So let me do that one more time. We're going to create one more signed URL for uploading files. So I'm going to say send. It created another temporary URL for me. I will copy the URL without the double quotes, just the https slash da 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 ending with region equals US. Copy it. I will use this plus sign at the top to basically create a new empty request in Postman, and I will paste the URL in this API endpoint address. But again, we want to upload a new file to our bucket, so we need to change the method from get to put. So the request should look like this. Put https developer API address.com OSS v2 sign resource something 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 region equals US. All right. And what we want to do is go to the body because we actually need to we need to include the actual file with the request when uploading. So we do that in the body section of the request. And here we can choose what kind of request, whether it should be form data, URL encoded form data, GraphQL, JSON, whatever. We want binary. We want to include the actual bytes of our uploaded file or Revit file in this case. So we select binary, and when you hit the select file input here, you have an option to select a file from your local machine. So that's what I did. So I said new file from my machine, and let's say RST basic sample project. Okay, so now we have our request configured. So we know we want to call the put request on this URL, and we want to include a specific file from our local machine. So if I hit send, it will run for a while. It will be uploading. Um, it will be uploading the my Revit file, and it will call it test RVT in the bucket. Okay, so this is how you upload files to a bucket. And again, I didn't change the name, so actually this new Revit file was uploaded as test dot um, test.rvt. So we still see there. All right, so let me take a look at the Q&A. I have a question about speeding up uploads or downloads. Is it possible to stream a file or chunk it? So streaming, I think that's something that Postman may already be doing. Where like it should be possible. Um, I think yeah, it may or I think Postman may already be streaming files when you include them with the body. Um, and chunking, we do support chunks, like chunked uploads or chunked downloads in our APIs. Can actually see that here. I think, let me see. Let's say, yeah, badge generate signed S3 upload. So you can actually say, I want to upload a file, which is very large, and I want to upload it in like 10 chunks. And we will generate 10 upload URLs for you to upload the file to, or the segments of your file to. So it's also possible. It's more advanced. So for this webinar, we chose the simple path of simply uploading the file in its entirety. Okay. Um, if you get an error on generating the signed URL, make sure that you specify the correct bucket key. that exists, right? Because if you keep this to the default, I think there was some weird string initially coming from the OpenAPI spec. It will try and create a signed URL for a bucket that you don't own. So you would very likely get a 404 error on that. Okay. Um, that would be the one. And then also make sure that you specify some kind of object key. That would be the name of the object that would eventually be created when you use the signed URL to upload your file. All right. Then I can get the URL, please repeat. I'm not sure what you mean, Ian. If you could maybe clarify. Um, when sending requests in generate OSS, it's giving me 404 not found. Again, make sure. I think you would probably get 404 not found if you used a bucket key that doesn't exist or a bucket key that you don't have access to, right? So let me try that here. If I try and use some bucket name, so I know that this is not my bucket. I know I don't have any bucket called some bucket. If I try and run this, okay, so I get 403, right? So it means that I can't create a signed URL because I don't have access. I don't own a bucket called some bucket. And if I try some bucket that doesn't exist, now I get 404. See? So it's basically telling me, no, I can't generate a signed URL because I this bucket does not exist. That's why you may get 404. I hope that makes sense. Rafael, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Uploading very large files, which is quite common with Autodesk, right? Some large BIM models. Um, yeah, uploading in or downloading in chunks is definitely useful, and that's why we added those capabilities to the object simple storage APIs. Okay, I get bucket listed, use key from the list, but still get 404. Again, Jadranko, if you keep getting 404, make sure that you use a valid bucket key as well as some object key, right? I don't know if I set this to some weird string that's not supported, like if I use angle brackets, I think that may fail as well. Oh no, that actually succeeded. So it uses URL encoding. So these characters are allowed here, but don't use them. Like use something like simple RVT or some simple file name. All right. Hint, select access with read write. That might be David. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe if you're struggling with some uploads with using the signed URL, when you go back to the params section of the generate OSS signed URL request, make sure to enable the access query parameter, right? We want to make sure we want to tell the platform that, hey, when you're creating the signed URL, make it read enabled as well as write enabled. Okay. All right. Does it matter if the bucket is transient? No, it doesn't matter. If you set the data retention policy to be transient, all it means is that any kind of files you upload to the bucket will be automatically removed after 24 hours. Yeah, object key, Jadranko, set the object key to whatever file name you want your uploaded file to have. Right? So let's say I used test.rvt. So basically, when I generated the signed URL, I said, okay, whenever I upload some content to this URL, I want this uploaded content to be called test.rvt in my bucket. If you're getting errors that say unable to parse JSON, make sure that you don't have any strange characters in your JSON payload. So let's say when generating the signed URL, it should only be the opening and closing curly brackets. Perfect. All right. So that is a wrap for the first part of our webinar today. I hope everybody has been able, I hope we've been able to clear most of the questions and issues here. Um, I hope, yeah. Any other issues or yeah, if you could give me a thumbs up if you're all set, or give me a thumbs down if somebody is still struggling. Perfect. Awesome. Great. So you all have your buckets created and files uploaded and your requests configured in Postman. That's great. So in the next part, we will actually start playing with the more visual part of Postman. That's the Postman flows. So now let me pause the recording. And we're recording again. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back for the part two of our Postman Flows webinar today. In the second part, we are finally moving to, again, the more interesting, the more visual part of Postman, this feature called Postman Flows, where you can design and chain together the API requests that we've been configuring in the first part. You can chain them together and start building very interesting flows in a low code, no code style, basically. And we'll start by creating something called a flow module. And it's probably something I should also explain. Well, let me switch over to Postman. So we're now jumping into the flows section here. And as you'll see here, you can create something called an action or a flow module. Flow module is basically a small flow. So again, you can think of a flow as just a bunch of building blocks representing API calls that are chained together to do something. You can either use that as is, as a flow that you can trigger manually, or you can even set it up so to have the flow triggered automatically by some external signal. Or you can save this flow as a module, which means you can take this entire thing, the flow that you've built, and you can reuse it in other flows. So whatever chain of API calls you put together in your visual diagram, you can then actually save that as a module and you can use it as a single block in other flows. So it's this idea of, reusability and composability that these flow modules enable. So in this second part of our webinar, we will build a flow module that you can either try and run on its own to test it out, or later you will actually be able to use this entire flow as a block in another visual diagram later on. Well, that will be the fourth part of our webinar today. Okay. So in this case, the flow that we want to build is a flow that will list all of our buckets. Because remember, getting kind of like exactly Yadrango, kind of like Dynamo. Um, Keep in mind, as you saw earlier, when you want to, let's say, list buckets, you will not necessarily get the full list in that response to the API request. You may get the first page, right? And then, if you remember, at least in my case, because I used one of my I used my APS credentials where I have over 20 different buckets. Then in the JSON response, you may get this field called next, which basically tells you, hey, there's more, right? Like there's a next page that you want to call to keep getting additional pages, additional buckets. This is done so that, again, like if there is a large number of items, we don't return all of them in one large JSON that could be, I don't know, like gigabytes. So what we want to do for now in this second part of our webinar is build a flow that will be able to actually go iterate in a loop through all these pages of your request of your OSS buckets to build the complete list of buckets in the end. So that already will give us a nice introduction into how the Postman flows work and what type of blocks you have available there. And uh, later we will be able to reuse this module, this flow module, in another flow to build more complex automations. Okay? So what we'll do is first we will add a helper request to Postman that we will need for retrieving the additional pages. And we will create this visual flow where we will call the standard, get buckets request in the visual flow. And then we will check if a next field is available on the output. And if it is, we will continue going through a loop while the next field is present, and we will be concatenating, combining the pages of buckets that we get from the calls until we get to a point where we call the final request to get the final page, and suddenly there is no more next field. So that is an indication for us that, okay, we've now gone through all the pages and we will just list, let's say, all the collected buckets in the output from this module. And we will create something called a snapshot, which is really like you save a specific version of your visual diagram in time, because this specific version you can then use in in other flows. All right, well, let's do that. In our tutorial, we are now jumping into part 2. So let me also copy and paste this in the chat. So we're now looking at the part 2 of our tutorial online. And as we explain here, again, what I said, for all the OSS APIs that return a larger number of resources or entities, we use this standard pagination where the JSON response will always return a field called items, which will be an array of the actual items, buckets or objects. And optionally, if there's more, the JSON object will also include a field called next, which will contain the fully defined URL to obtain the next page. Okay, so now the thing is, what we want to be able to do is call this next page, but we actually want to be able to leverage the authorization setup we configured for our collection. So in order to be able to do that, let's go back to our collections for a second. And under the object storage service, we'll create a new request called, we can call it get next page, right? And in here, instead of hard coding a specific URL, because the URL to obtain the next page is actually going to be dynamic, right? We don't know beforehand what the next page URL is going to look like. We're going to turn it into a variable. So we're going to call it something like next page URL. Okay. It's for now, it's red. That means that, this variable hasn't been defined anywhere yet. Postman doesn't know it. That's okay. If I go back to the tutorial, I want to make sure that I'm using the same wording here. So next page URL. Yeah. Um, we can add it to, we can define this variable at the collection level. So by doing that, so again, I clicked the red variable and I selected that it should be stored at the collection level. So now let me also show you. Come on. If I go back to my collection and variables, I see that I now have new variable defined here called next page URL, and there's no value for it yet. And that's perfectly fine. So for now, don't worry about the next page URL inside the double curly braces being red here. It basically Postman is telling us, hey, you want to use some kind of variable here, but I don't have any data for it. That's fine. The reason we do that here is because whenever you're using these requests as the visual blocks in your flow, any kind of variables will appear as inputs to these blocks. And I'll show you what that means in a second. So for now, let's just save this get next page request. And again, the reason we're doing this, the reason we're creating this helper request is because remember, this request is part of our object storage service collection, which means that it inherits the authorization setup from the collection. And we want that, right? Because when we want to call the next page of our buckets, we still need to authenticate that request. And this is how we can do that by generating this request, keeping it under our collection so that it inherits the authorization data. And by the way, I can see here, see, I'm getting a notification that my token has already expired. So I could either manually refresh it, or let me try this. If I go to, let's say, list buckets and I run the request, see, it automatically refreshed it for me. So now it's 11 a.m. for me, and now the new token will expire at noon exactly. So, because remember, we checked the auto refresh option when we were configuring authorization for our collection, right? So it automatically, it's really nice, I think here. It's a nice feature of Postman. It automatically refreshes the token for you so that you don't have to worry about that yourself. All right, so we have our helper request called get next page. And by defining this non-existent or like non-defined variable called next page URL, we we did this so that the visual block that we will use in the flow will actually show next page URL as an input that we can connect other inputs to. Okay. So now we can finally go to flows and we can create our first flow module. So go to flows in the sidebar and you should see this blue link saying create flow module. We do that. And that is taking a surprisingly long time. Inflow hang title processing your requests. That is a little bit concerning. Is this okay? There we go. Is this taking too long for you guys as well, or when you click the create new flow module, or was it's taking a while? Oh, okay, so maybe some slowdown on the Postman side. Hmm. All right, so hopefully this is not going to be a problem for us. Just a few more seconds. Okay. I think one thing to keep in mind with Postman, talking about Postman in general, is that even though here we're using okay, there we go, a desktop application, it's actually fully connected. So any requests you make or any flows you build, they're all basically created in the cloud, not on your local machine. Oh, loading failed. Oh boy. Okay. We are benchmarking. Pedro, I think you're right. We're maybe unintentionally DDoSing. Oh boy. Yadranko, I think you guys are right. We I hope we haven't taken down the Postman servers. All right, so guys, try it again. And yeah, maybe we need to make groups. So there's like 200 people on this webinar, so maybe we need to form groups of 10 people. We'll let you, create flows group by group. Fail successfully. I love that. Yeah, failed but worked. Okay. Oh boy. So let's wait for a little bit more. Um, okay. Well, this is not something um I planned for that we could put too much pressure on the Postman servers. The web app version worked, Andrew. Okay, so well, I guess again it should be the same because even here, even the desktop one, whether you're using web or desktop, they both still talk to the same backend, is my understanding. Okay. Good. All right. So hopefully again, like those of you who haven't been able to create a flow module, keep trying. Still loading. All right. So just so let it you know let it keep trying in the background. And for now, I can maybe tell you a little bit more about the UI, the interface of what you will eventually see, right? So this is the canvas that you should see eventually for your flow module. Typically, it looks like this. You have some start block, and then from there you can start basically start creating additional blocks and chain them together and form loops with them, and et cetera, et cetera. And these blocks can be either some built-in blocks. You can either, you can add them from here using this add blocks element here, or using the toolbar at the bottom. So here, if I click, so Alberto, you say after you close and reopen the new flow module, it works. So okay, so maybe trying that as well, like maybe even restarting Postman. But again, I think my gut feeling is that that won't matter as much. It's more about you being lucky and hitting the Postman servers at the right time so that they actually do create the module for you. So in the UI here at the bottom in the toolbar, you have this, add a block. So here, basically get a full list of blocks that are available for Postman and flows. The most common one that we are going to be using is HTTP request. This is a block where you can actually pick one of the API requests from your collection that you want the flow to call, right? Flow module, again, remember later when we're done building this flow, we will save it as a module so that we can use it in other flows. And then you have typical blocks like condition, validate, if, delay, so that here you can, check the output from a certain API call. And based on the data and the response, you can branch out and call other blocks for one scenario or another block for a different scenario. You also have these repeat and for loops so that you can, if you have, let's say, if your API call returns a list of things, you can fan out. You can use the for loop to basically call some block for every entry of that list, of that array. And then later you can use collect to fan in again. So collect all the outputs from the blocks that were called for the individual items of your array and combine them back into one array. Um, and you also have like some logging and display. Display is quite nice because again, like display is where you can display some outputs from your API calls in form of, it can be just a JSON, or it could be a table, or it could be actually some graphics, like it could be a bar chart or a pie chart or something. Like if you remember what we showed in the screenshot, that's what we're going for, right? Ultimately, we want to be able to show a bar chart with the storage amount of storage used by individual buckets. And some additional blocks you can use for providing data as input to your block. So you can provide some string, bool, number, fields or date times, or select. This is something I'll also explain later. This is very useful. The select block is useful for picking a specific piece of data from your responses. So let's say you make an API call in your flow, and the API call returns a complex JSON, and you're only interested in one piece of information nested somewhere in the JSON. The select block is useful for picking just that one or just some subset of your JSON. All right, so how about now, guys? Have you all been able to create your flow module, or is somebody still stuck? Can you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if you're stuck? Oh, good. Cool. So I'm wondering if if we should expect to get contacted by postman today in the afternoon. All right, awesome, cool. So we're ready to start building our first flow. Oh, Andy Chan, what happened? You're still stuck? And Duran as well. Ah, okay. So please keep trying. We'll go slow. Um, Hopefully you can catch up. Close Postman, reopened. It worked straight away. Mark. Okay, maybe my theory is wrong. So those of you still uh, stuck, please try Mark's recommendation. Try closing Postman and reopening it. And see if that helps. Okay. All right. So let's see. So we have our new module. It's called new flow module. So let's click the title and rename it to, what are we renaming it to in the tutorials? List buckets. OSS or something like that. This is just how it appears in your list of in your list of modules in the left sidebar. Okay, perfect. So first thing we want to do is we want to get a list of buckets. So again, one option to do that is by adding an HTTP request either through the toolbar or here by clicking this helper element in the canvas, send a request. Hit send a request, and here, see, we have our first block. And we want to specify which request from our collection we actually want this block to call. So I'm going to click this input that is glowing blue as asking me to specify the request. And see, I can now browse through my collections, folders, and I can see now under object storage service buckets, I have my request called get list buckets. There you go. See? And now, again, reiterating on what I mentioned earlier, notice that we have this send input, which is basically a timing trigger saying when this request should be triggered. But we also have some additional inputs like this one called base URL. And the reason we see this input here is because if we look at the list buckets request, it actually uses a variable in its path. See, so instead of us hard coding HTTPS developer API auditors.com, when we imported the OpenAPI spec, it automatically created this base URL variable at the collection level for us. And since there is any kind of variable on this request in the flow, it will appear as an input, meaning that we could, if we wanted to, potentially define this input from another block if we wanted to use a different kind of base URL. So any kind of variables, again, the bottom line, the TLDR is any kind of variables you define in your request will appear as inputs in the flow for this, in this case, the list buckets request. Awesome. And here, as you can see, and at the output, you have two options, right? Either this request may succeed or it may fail. And depending on that, on the results there, you want to maybe handle the failure as well. For now, we will just assume that, our request, our API call for listing our buckets will succeed. So we will assume that, the output will always emit some kind of data. Okay. Now, what do we want to do with the data? Now, actually, what I'm thinking is I don't want to run the flow too many times so that we don't waste like the free runs that we have, but I'm just going to run it here for you so that you see that you can actually, even this is already a functioning flow. And what we can do is here, we can hit the run button and you can see that our flow has actually run and succeeded because we see this orange little dot next to success and we can click that to see that, hey, okay, this is good. So my flow called this list buckets request and it returned some response where the body had a JSON field called items, which was an array of 10 entries. These are my first 10 buckets, right? And it also had this next field. So this is an indication. You may not see it, right? Like when you run this flow, you may not see the next field because maybe you don't have more than 10 buckets registered by your application. I do. So I do see the next field here. And apart from the body, you also get some additional information like the HTTP response data, right? So you see like what was the status of your API call and what were the headers. So maybe in some cases, maybe you would want to pick some information from the response headers and send that to another block as an input, right? So that's why we don't see just the JSON coming back. We see, an HTTP response information as well as the response body, if there's any. So now what we want to do is, let me see, just again, making sure I follow the same flow um, in as in the tutorial. We want to pick, let's say, the items from the response and the next field, if there is one. And There's a couple ways to do that. One option is I can drag, see this little half circle from the success output, drag it out, and now I can pick what the next field or what the next block should be. So in this case, I can say select. And select block is, as I mentioned earlier, one that lets you pick a specific piece of information from a potentially very large JSON response you may get from another call. If I click here, since I already ran the flow once, so Postman knows what kind of data is going out of the success output, it shows me, hey, there was actually a field called body and HTTP and tests. And what I can do is I can say, okay, here I want to extract body.items, right? So remember, body.items will basically select the list of buckets, this array of buckets, which in my case has 10 items. In your case, it may have one or two, or none if you don't have any buckets, right? So you can either type this by hand, so you simply use this dot notation, right? So body.items means from the response, take the body field, and from the body object, take the items field, body items. Alternatively, what I could also do, what I found recently in Postman, what you can do is you can grab in the output preview here, in my case, I could even grab one of the fields, let's say the next, and drag it outside, and it will actually create the select block for me automatically, selecting body next. Right? So this is how we can now start extracting specific information from the response from our list buckets request call, right? We're getting the list of items and we're getting the body next, which again may or may not be defined. So this could actually, in your case, this could be empty, right? This could be returning empty value because there is no next field in the response. All right. Next thing, next part we want to do is add a condition to check whether the next field is actually present, right? So we will add a condition block that will check the presence of the field and and then based on the outcome, whether or not the next field is available, it will take a certain action. So we want to add a condition. Now, a condition block, let's try and use the toolbar in this case. So we hit the add block button and I can search for condition. And I'm going to place a condition somewhere in here. Now, what we want to do is we want to connect both the list of items as well as the next field into the condition because we will, again, based on a certain condition we type in the block, we will want to send both of these pieces of information to any of the branches of whether the condition is met or not. So what we want to do is grab the outputs of this select block from body items and connect it to a variable in our condition. And we can double click this value one to rename this to results, let's say. And we will also connect the next field to our condition and name it next. Okay. So again, what we're doing here is we're picking two specific fields from the JSON response from our list buckets call, and we're feeding these values into our condition. So again, this variable here that we named the results will be a list of items from the API call, and the next variable will be probably a string if there is a next field, or it will be empty. And so now we can actually start writing multiple conditions, and the condition block will go through these conditions one by one. And for the conditions that match, it will basically output some data, some values for next processing. Okay, so we will only have one condition for now. It's called condition one. You click the pen icon next to it to rename it. I'm going to call it has next page. And the only expression I need inside the condition is exclamation mark, next. So what this means, this is because, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention, in the top right corner of the condition block, you have this drop down that lets you select the programming language you want to use in your conditions, right? So you can either use Postman's own language called flow query language, or Postman also supports TypeScript. So here we're just going to use TypeScript. And by typing this TypeScript expression in the condition, we're basically saying this condition will evaluate to true whenever next variable is defined. In cases where next has some text in it, right? If it's empty or undefined, this condition will evaluate to false. So this condition will not, this branch will not be executed, right? If that's the case, the branch that will be executed from the condition branch is this default one. So again, we have one condition, and this output will be triggered in case of in case this condition succeeds. And this default output will be triggered when the condition doesn't succeed. Okay. And I see we have more questions in the chat, so let me pause for a second. Pedro, exactly, you're right. Body.next or body.items. You can either type it by hand, you can type any text here, or if Postman already knows what the output from the list buckets block looks like, it will actually give you some help. See, it's telling you what I'm seeing coming out of the list buckets block is a body that has items, which is a list of things, and the next field, which is a string. And each item has, it's a JSON object that has a bucket key, which is a string. It has policy key, da 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 da. So it's already giving you indication of the shape of the data coming out of the list buckets block. But again, exactly as Pedro said, you can type it by hand. And again, it's very likely that you won't see anything under body next, because if you just created your first bucket and you're calling list buckets, it will just return the first page with your one bucket, and there will be no next field because there is no more pages for you. It's only in my case that I may see the next field because I actually have more than 10 buckets, right? So if I wanted to get additional buckets, I would need to call this next field. That's why I'm extracting both the actual list of buckets as well as the next field in case it exists. By the way, here, the red squiggly lines in the condition block, don't worry about that. That means at this point is that, the expression doesn't understand what the next variable is yet because we haven't run the flow yet. So no string has arrived to this input yet. So this is not defined, and that's why this TypeScript expression for now is complaining that, hey, I don't know next. That's fine. That is expected. Okay, great. Now now we can handle the default branch here, meaning that if there is no next value available, so meaning that if there are no additional pages, we can just finish our flow and output whatever results we see coming in the results input, right? Because that means basically there's no more pages, we can just output, we have all the buckets we need. So we can grab this default output from our condition block and create a new block called output. This will simply output whatever data was returned from the condition block. And by the way, one thing we need to keep in mind here is that this default branch will not only return the list of buckets, but it will actually return a JSON object that has two fields, results and next. So any inputs you send into your condition block, all these will be returned as JSON objects from any of your condition outputs. So what we need to expect coming out of this condition block is a JSON object that has one field called results and one field called next. So what we can do here, we could use another select block, or we can actually say, whatever data flows into this input, pick just a field called results. So you can type it in by hand inside this select block in the output field, in the output block. We're basically saying whatever data flows in, Just pick a field called results. Okay. So this is the simple scenario where there is no next page and we can just output the results as is. And let me also, I think in the tutorials, we're also renaming the output to all buckets. Okay. Now, again, for you, for most of you, this would probably be sufficient because, again, you don't have additional pages of buckets. You don't have more than 10 buckets, likely. I do. So, and I want to make sure I want to show you how to make this flow really complete so that in the future, as you start creating more and more buckets, um, you want to make sure that this flow will actually account for that scenario. So what we want to do is we want to handle this, the output from this has next page. So if there is actually a next page, we will want to do something, right? And in this case, what we will want to do is we will want to send another HTTP request. And in this case, that will be the helper get next page request that we created at the beginning of this part. Okay, and look at this. Do you remember when we actually defined the URL of the request to be a variable called next page URL? That's why it now appears here as an input that we can specify. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the output from the same condition branch here, has next page, and I'm going to connect it to my next page URL input. And again, be careful, right? Because the data that will be flowing out of this condition output will be a JSON object that has two fields, one called results, one called next. And what we want to send into our next page URL is just the next field. So you can either, again, use IntelliSense because in some cases, Postman will help you. It will show you what kind of data will be coming into this input. Or you can just type in next by hand. Okay. So this is how we can actually handle the scenario where there actually is an additional page. And in that case, we basically request the additional page using our next page URL variable. And next, we will want to concatenate the results. So now concatenation, the way that works is um, there isn't really a block in Postman flows that would concatenate two arrays into one automatically, but there is a block called evaluate. And the evaluate block is similar to the condition in that you can type in a TypeScript expression that will be used to process whatever kinds of inputs you send in and output them as an output of the block, right? So let me grab the success output from our get next page block and let me look for evaluate. Okay, we have our evaluate block here. And here again, we can specify, just like with the condition, we can specify multiple inputs to our expression, and we can choose whether we want to write our expression using TypeScript or a Flow query language. So we'll keep TypeScript. Um, and all right, so what we want to add in is basically we'll need two inputs, right? We will need the intermediate results of all our buckets, all our pages, and we will also need this next page of buckets to add to the complete list. So what we want to do is here, we want to name this variable items. And again, keep in
Sorry,
mind,
Pedro. Can you zoom in a little bit on your screen?
like this.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right. Thank you, Pedro. All right. So when we call our get next page block, the output will be just like before. It will be an object that will have fields like body, HTTP, and inside the body, there will be fields like items and maybe next. So we want to extract this information because this items variable, that's the input to our evaluate block, we only want to fetch the list of the next page of buckets. So what we can do is, again, I'm getting some support from Postman here because it knows what kind of data will go out of this success output, but I can type it by hand. I can say body dot items, right? So just like before, we were extracting body items from our original call. We will be extracting body items from this get next page API request. And what we also need is the intermediate results of the previous pages, right? So let's create another variable, call it results, and we will grab the output of our condition here and add it here, right? So basically, again, whenever we hit this condition branch where there is a next page, we will get the next page, we will get the intermediate results and send them as set them as the variable to our evaluate block. And again, repeating just for, making sure that this clicks, the outputs being emitted out of this output of the condition will be a JSON object that has a field for every variable that is coming into the condition. So this JSON object will have two fields, one called results, one called next. So as we bring this data into our evaluate branch, we want to pick just the results. And that's it. That's all the inputs we need for our evaluate branch for collecting, concatenating the pages of buckets. So now we just need to type in our expression in TypeScript, and in TypeScript you can easily concatenate two arrays by typing, one array.concat and then passing in the second array as a parameter. So what this means is that we take the intermediate results from our if condition. We take the new page of buckets from the get next page call, and we concatenate them together, and the result is output from here. So the result will be a new array where the results are concatenated with a new page of buckets. Okay. And the final part that's remaining here is that we want to repeat this, right? We want to, how to say that? If there's a next page coming out of, if there's a next field in the second page, we know again, we need to repeat, right? So in this case, let me just grab the results and bring them into the input of our condition because we want to, this is where we start creating the loop. We want to loop our condition as long as the outputs still have a next field. Okay. So what we want to do, I believe the best approach here would be to grab the next field from here. Let me see. What would be the best one? I mean, there's a couple of options. I want to make sure that we're aligned with the tutorial. Just very quickly. Oh, okay. Sorry. So let me actually change that because in the tutorial, we explicitly pick the body items and body next from the next page as well. So let me, for now, delete this one, this connection. And instead of sending the outputs from the get next page block directly to the evaluate, we will, just like before, we will pick the next field and we will pick again the body items. So again, we don't need to do that, but for clarity and again to be consistent with the tutorial, I'm just going to explicitly add these two select blocks to pick the next field and the items field from our get next page call. Okay. And now the items I can actually bring into our evaluate block, right? So here now I don't need to specify any selection inside the evaluate block because this select block will already feed us just the list of items that we need. Okay. And the body next, this is where we actually do the loop. and we bring the body next back to our condition, right? And then this is where we're looping so that the next page will concatenate the results. And if there is again next field, we will go through the whole thing again. We will call get next page one more time until we get to a point and we concatenate the results until we get to a point where next field is no longer present, meaning that we are at the final page. So then when we send the next field to our condition, we find out that, hey, there is no more next field. So the condition actually executes the default branch, which will just output the results. So I hope that makes sense. Let me try and maybe tidy up this a little bit. Okay. And let me see. Let me pause for a sec. Any questions in the Q&A or in the chat? No, it looks like we're good. All right. So before running this one more time, yeah, give me is everybody on the same page? Let me know, or if you got stuck on something, what I want to do now is before running the flow, again, go through it just verbally and explain what's going to happen, right? And again, don't worry if you maybe missed some of the parts of the flow. Again, um, sorry, reconnecting the flows, that was the part I um, probably confused some folks. Um, Again, the reason that happened was that you have in Postman flows, you can pick fields from your API responses in different ways. You can either manually insert something called a select block where you type in the path, the part of the JSON you want to extract, or you can connect the outputs directly to another block. And here, see if whenever I define any kind of variable like results, next, or items or results, I have the same, you see, recognize the same icon as in the select block. I can actually define the path pick um, to pick the path from the incoming data within this input. So again, this is the same thing, right? Either explicitly picking a portion of your JSON data using this select block, or you can just send the full response to your to another block and then filter or pick a subset of the JSON data by typing the same path inside here. All right, so let's take a look. What will happen here? When this flow runs, it will call our list buckets request. No other inputs are needed here, right? We're just calling list buckets with no additional inputs. Ideally, this will result in a success output, which will be an object with the following fields: body, HTTP, tests, binary, right? Body, the body field it captures the output, the response from this API call. So in our case, the body will include the JSON you would typically see when you call list buckets as a request. So when I call list buckets, this kind of object is included in the body field coming out of the success output. So then what we do is we use two select blocks to pick specific data from the JSON. By typing body.items, we will pick the body field coming out from the output from the list buckets and the items field within, which should be an array of buckets. It could be an empty array. It could be, there could be multiple buckets depending on how many you created. And in the same way, we're also trying to extract a next field from the API response. And in my case, when I look at the body of the response, I do see the next field there because I have more than 10 buckets. You may not see there. In your case, the next field might be missing, and that's okay. Yeah, that's okay, Alberto. Again, in your case, if you don't have more buckets, you won't see the next field because there is no more pages to look at, right? So the next field may or may not be present. Don't worry about that if it's not there. So it's perfectly fine that the body next block here will return none, empty, null, right? And that's perfectly fine because in our condition, we're actually checking, is the next field, is the next variable empty, or is there any next page for us to look at? If there is no more, if the next field is empty, if there is no next field coming out of list buckets, the condition block basically jumps to the default branch, which means we just go directly to output and we're done. And again, what I was saying earlier, remember that any data coming out of the condition will be objects with a field for every single variable input. So our condition has two inputs, results and next. And so if we want to just grab the results and send them to the output, here, see, I use the second option. Instead of adding a custom select block in between, I just take the entire output from the condition block. And inside here, I say, whatever data flows in, pick just the field called results. All right. Only in case where the next variable is actually defined and has some string, has some URL for the next page, that's when this path in the flow gets executed and we call another block called get next page. This is the helper request we created under our object storage service collection. And since this request depends on a variable we decided to call next page URL. This next page URL appears as an input of this block. So what we say is, if there is a next page, call our get next page request and grab the actual value of the next variable, which is the URL, and pass it as an input to get next page. Okay. And again, here we are assuming that this get next page call will succeed. And we are, just like before, we were extracting the list of buckets and the next field from the original call. Here we are extracting the list of items and the next field from the next page, right? And the next page of buckets we extract, we send into this special evaluate block that is used to combine this new page of buckets with all the buckets we found before. This is the evaluate block. So we are bringing in, we created one input variable called items. That's the new page of buckets. And we also have another input called results, and that is the intermediate results of the buckets we have combined so far, all the pages we've concatenated so far. Okay. And we just have a simple TypeScript expression here that adds this new page of buckets to the running concatenated list. And the results, which will be this concatenated list of buckets, we send back as an input to our condition. And we also take the next field from when we call the get next page, and we send it as an input to the condition as well. So basically, this is where we form the loop. We go back to the condition and we say, this is the new results with the latest page concatenated. Is there another page? If yes, we hit this condition and we continue the same process again. We call get next page again. We extract the next field and the items field. We concatenate the results, the items to the overall results, and we check again. We send the next field to the condition and we say, okay, is there again a next field? And if not, then we go to the default block and we output the results, which at this point contains all the pages of our buckets combined. So let me try and run that on my end. So you will see that. So, okay, so some of the outputs got highlighted with this orange orange circle. So what happened first was we called list buckets. It returned, in my case, 10 buckets and a next page because I have more than 10 buckets. Okay, we extracted the 10 items here. We extracted the next field here. And we fed the first page of buckets and the next field into my condition. And here, the condition detected, okay, next is actually defined. So we hit this branch of the condition. See, that's why it's got the little orange dot. So first we hit it and basically with some results and next page flowing into our get next page block. Let me see. I can look at the inputs. So I can see that the next page that came in was this URL. And we called, this URL to get the next page of buckets. It succeeded. So in this case, you can take a look. See? So in this case, it returned only 3 buckets and there is no more next field because I'm at the final page. There is no more pages of buckets. So I'm trying to extract the items and the next field. You can see now there is no little orange dot because nothing was extracted from here. In body items, we only extracted the 3 extra buckets. We concatenated them with the overall results. We fed this empty next field and the concatenated results back to our condition. And in this case, for the final page, we found, okay, there is no next value, no next page to look at. So we hit the default branch and we send the results to the output. And by the way, here you can actually see next is null and results is 23, which in my case means I have 23 buckets. So we ran the first list buckets request. It returned 10 fields and 10 buckets, and it included a next page. So we ran get next page. This block returned another 10 buckets and another next field because I actually have 23 buckets. So it returned 10 items and another next page. So I concatenated the next 10 buckets with the first 10 buckets and I got the next field. I fed it into my condition. It detected that, hey, there is again a next page. So we hit this branch from the condition again. We ran our get next page. In this case, this block returned only 3 buckets in my case, and no next page. So we took the 3 items, we concatenated them to the results, and we fed the results back to the condition. And now, since there was no more next page to look at, we hit the default branch, and we have our 23 buckets listed here. So that's our fully functioning flow for listing all buckets, all the pages of buckets for my specific APS credentials. And by the way, you can see here, it now says, Postman now says I have 46 out of 50 free runs remaining on my free plan. Pedro, a really good point. Yes, by default, the pagination for listing buckets or objects or anything in OSS is set to 10, I believe. So you can change that as well. So if you go back to your list buckets request, you'll see that there are some optional query parameters like region, limit, or start at. Limit by default is 10. This is something you could, if you wanted to, use to configure the size of a page. So you could say, I want my page of results be not 10 items, but let's say 20 or 50. I think the maximum is 100. I think that's in the documentation. Yeah, acceptable values are 1 to 100. Okay, so I'm working with the default, so that's why I had to make 3 calls to get the first 10 buckets, to get the other 10 buckets, and then to get the final 3 buckets because of my 23 total. All right. And that is our flow. So we tested it. I hope you can run it. So again, can you give me thumbs up? Are you able to run this flow? And do you see your buckets actually showing up in the output? And again, when you run the flow, you can double check because whenever you select any block on the canvas, you can see what inputs arrived to it and what outputs were emitted out, went out of that block. So if I select output block, you can see I only received one input. That's the all buckets, and that was 23 items and the next field, which is null. Okay, so I see a comment in the chat. I can't get the variable to appear under get next page even after I have added 11 buckets. So you don't see this next page URL variable. If that's the case, go back to the helper request, the get next page, and make sure that you actually specify the variable using the double curly braces, right, as the endpoint. And you will probably want to, like first time I clicked it, now I see that this variable is already defined at the collection level. But when I selected it for the first time, Postman was asking me, where do you want to define this variable? Is it at the collection level, at the environment, or global? So make sure that it's defined in one of these places. Um, After that, that should be enough for the block to show you the next page URL. And Nathan says, I get the expression in the condition is giving me red squiggly lines and saying can't find the name next. That's okay. That is expected. That's because you probably haven't run the flow yet. So it before running the flow, the condition here is looking at the expression you typed in, the TypeScript expression, and it says, well, I don't have any data for next because no data has arrived to it yet. So it hasn't even defined a variable that the expression could use. So if you see red squiggly lines and Postman complaining here, don't worry about that. They will disappear as soon as you run the flow and or actually, I mean, yeah, as soon as, some kind of value comes here, even if it's null. Okay, 12 buckets first, and I can see a value in the input for next. Good. Perfect. Awesome. All right, so that is our first flow module. Again, you can run it on its own, or one more thing we need to do actually for the final step in our webinar is creating a snapshot. So again, this means basically creating saving a specific state of your flow in a specific point in time, right? Because then later, when you want to use that flow in that module in other flows, you'll need to specify you need to point it to a specific point in time, to a specific state of your module. So what you can do is in this toolbar on the right, there's like settings, snapshots, scenarios. You can open the snapshot and you can say create a snapshot. And we can just leave it as is. We're just going to create a snapshot one, right? So now you have your versioning in place. Now you can start tweaking the flow if you wanted to make changes to it, and then you can always go back to the previous snapshot if you wanted to. And then we also have a snapshot version that we can refer to when later building another flow using this module. Okay. All right, so let me let me look at the Q&A. What exactly passes through the condition block if condition is false? Yadranko, good question. Let me repeat that one more time. Again, something I had to learn about Postman as well. For blocks like condition, you specify certain inputs, right? You may have one or more inputs for your condition. It could be just one input that you will have some expression for, or it could be multiple. Then you specify one or more conditions that will be basically expressions using any of these inputs. So in my case, I only have one condition with a simple expression which just checks whether the next input is defined and truthy, meaning that if it's a non-empty string, right? Um, and now the important part is that always, no matter what condition, what branch you hit, and no matter what output you follow from your condition block, all the branches, all the outputs will always return an object where each field represents each of the inputs that were ingested by the condition block. So in my case, I have two inputs, results and next. This is what I decided to call them. Any output from the condition block will always be an object that has two fields, results and next. If I add a third variable foo, every object coming out of any branch of the condition block will always have three fields, results, next, and foo. Okay? And again, you can explore that here. You can see whenever we hit this branch of the condition, when we matched the has next page condition, the output was results and next. It was an object that had results and next. When we hit the default branch of the condition, the output was again results and next. With the only difference that now, of course, the next field was null because we hit the default branch, meaning the next value is no longer truthy. Okay. So that's that's how the condition block works. All right. Can I do something with the output? Save it to a text or yeah, you can definitely do more. I mean, here we could, instead of just saying output, we could add a display. Okay. And the display would basically receive um, or let's say, let me do this. This is not in the tutorial, just to show you the idea, to get the idea. Let me add a select block and say, I want to, from the object that is coming out of my condition, which again has two fields, results and next, I only want the results. I'm going to say results. And I want to feed them into a display block. And now when you add a display block, you will see in this drop down where you can choose all the different ways in which Postman can visualize the data for you, right? So again, we can expect that here we will receive an array of JSON objects describing the individual buckets. So each object will have the bucket name, I guess the data policy, right? The data retention policy key and stuff like that. We can say auto detect. So this field with this block will just display the data in whatever format it thinks it's most suitable. You could say, I want to show this as just, blank basic text, markdown, or as a table, right? So maybe if I try and say table, and let me try and run this workflow one more time. Hopefully I don't run out of my free credits. There you go. See? So what's coming out of this select block is just a list of objects where each object has bucket key, created date, and policy key for all my 23 buckets. And since I switched to table, it just automatically decided to, create a table with 3 columns and output all my buckets. That's one option. I'm not sure if there's a way to actually save the data out of here. To be honest, I haven't tried. We can try.
I think it's not possible because Postman does not have access to the local system. So
Right.
maybe
I mean,
doing some workarounds.
I think you can maybe do that from request. So if you say, list buckets, and I call my list buckets here, I can save the response, but probably not from flows. Let me see. Yeah, again, I haven't, if I do JSON, there is like an icon to copy, but not necessarily to save. So I'm not sure.
Isn't there a block for saving stuff? maybe. I don't know.
Oh, that's a good point. Let's see. I haven't tried, but yeah, maybe there is a block for saving file now. Maybe not. No, let's see. Uh, Not sure, not sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Might be an interesting feature. Yeah, looks like now.
Better, let's try lock block. If you,
Log block.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Maybe that one can save.
with the console.
Okay. So
Um,
if I run it again, let me see. 45. Oh, that's good. Okay. Yeah, can be generous. So now this sends it to a log. I can open it. So it output basically all the 23 elements in my console, the 23 buckets. But again, even here, I'm not sure if this can be saved in any way. Yeah, it's an interesting, that's a good question. Yeah, like in some of the automations, you would probably want to have the ability to um, save the output somewhere. Um, Copying, you can, yeah, Salvo, that's probably the one workaround I can think of. Like instead of table, I can just say JSON, and I could copy this and paste it to a file, right, and save it. So a little bit more manual, um, but possible. Yeah, good question. I'll try and do some online research later, see if there is a more automated way to be able to actually save these. Like, yeah, it'd be nice if I could save this as a CSV file or something. Nope. Record. Is there a block called record? Heavens. Oh, I see. No, I don't think so. That's just for building basically records, meaning objects with different key values. All right, but you get the idea, right? For our first flow module, I hope. Uh, at least I hope it's clear what the value that this type of environment offers. Cool. All right. So let me see. Any other questions? Um, During our work, we sometimes need an SDK, and Open API is super convenient for generating one. Uh, are there plans to provide Open API specs for the rest of the APIs? Um, Not sure if there are plans, but we're definitely pushing for this. We started with a couple of the services that you can find on GitHub, like data management, model derivative, webhooks, authentication, and what was there? There was one more. Um, and the OSS. But yeah, so we already see a great feedback from customers using the specs, and we want to keep adding more. So now it's on us to push the individual engineering teams responsible for the services to start exposing, publishing their specs as well. Okay, do we have to create a snapshot again to save the changes? If you want to, yeah, I'm not going to create another snapshot here. I'm just modifying the flow to show you like how you can explore some of the data coming out of the flow, but I'm not going to save this one. I'm just going to keep the original snapshot that I'm going to use in the final flow that we will be building in the final part of today's webinar. All right. So this is a wrap for the part 2. So let me spin up our poll relaunch one more time, and you guys let me know again how long of a break you want to take. All right, okay. So far it looks like 15 minutes again is the winner. It's good. Oh, let me pause the recording as well. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the part three of our online training webinar on low code, no code systems. Today, dedicated to Postman flows. In the part three, we will build another flow module similar to the one we built previously, but this time, this module will be used for listing objects instead of buckets. And again, we will create a snapshot of the flow module so that we can later use it in the final part to actually build our automation that will calculate the storage use by individual buckets. Okay, in our tutorial, we're moving to part three, objects flow module. Let me paste the link in the chat. Okay, and a question, where is the recorded video shared? So the video is now being recorded, and later on, the program manager will share the recordings with all of the attendees. Typically, that's like a week after the event. All right. So what we're going to do, can go back to our Postman. We don't need to, because the flow we built previously for listing buckets, that's pretty much exactly the same thing, the same flow we will use for listing objects with just a few minor differences. So what we can do is, instead of recreating this whole flow from scratch, we can just duplicate it. So when you hover over the list buckets flow in Postman and use the three dots, you can use the clone option. This will ask you what workspace you want to clone the flow in, because this is something I haven't mentioned previously. Apart from, collections, environments, and flows and things like that, you can also structure your content in Postman into different workspaces. So you may have one workspace with different collections and environments and flows, and then you can have another workspace with different request collections and different environments and different flows. So in my case, I'm still going to use the same workflow that I've been using since the beginning today, the APS Postman tutorial. So I have my copy here. I will rename it to list objects, OSS. And what we want to do here, first of all, we want to change the first block, right? Because we don't want to list buckets, but objects. So I can keep the flow as is. Well, actually, let me clean this up. Let me delete the display, because that was just something we added for some exploration. And we will switch this first HTTP block from list buckets to list objects. So again, I can just simply browse through my Postman collections and folders, and I can find the list objects request that's under the objects folder. Okay. And when we do that, again, notice one thing, suddenly additional input appeared. And this is because when we take a look at the list objects request, it actually uses this bucket key variable that we specified earlier. And since this uses two variables, base URL and bucket key, then both of these appear as inputs. And in this case, we actually do need to provide the bucket key, right? Because we want to specify what bucket specifically we want to get the objects from. We can do that at the flow module level by actually creating an input to the start block. You can see there is this add input button. I can add it and say, let me just check my tutorial to make sure that I'm following the same naming conventions. All right, I'm just going to call it bucket key. Bucket key. And you can also specify what type of value this input is using this dropdown. Right now it says it's a string, which is correct. That's what we want. But then we could also specify that the input should be a Boolean, a number, date and time, or other more complex data types. Okay. And now what that means is we can actually take this bucket key input from the start block and pass it on to the bucket key input of our list objects. So now when we run our flow, we will somehow need to provide an input, which is going to be the bucket key, and I'll show you how to do that. But then the rest is pretty much the same, right? When you think about it. Again, we get a list of buckets, sorry, a list of objects, the first page at least. We extract the items field from the response, which is the list of objects, and we try and see if there is a field called next. We feed both of these into a condition block, and if the next field is defined, we keep looping and getting next page. And now the nice thing is, when you think about it, this helper block, this get next page, um, we can actually reuse it without any changes, right? Because we simply feed in the next page URL, which in this case will be a URL that gets the next page of objects instead of buckets, but there is no change needed for us here. All this works the same. So now with this block, we will request another page of objects. We extract the actual list of objects and the next field. We take the items, concatenate them with the total results so far, and we feed the concatenated results and the next field into the condition again. We're looping, and we're going to continue doing this until we've gone through all the pages of objects. Okay. And finally, when we hit the default branch of our condition, then we send the results into the output. So in this case, I'm just going to rename the output to all objects instead of all buckets. And that is pretty much it. Now we have our list objects flow module ready. We should already be able to use this and run it and test it out. But now if we try and run it, you'll notice that again, Postman won't let us at first because it will need some information from us, right? So if we try and say run, it says create a scenario first. And for each scenario, we need some input, and that is the bucket key. So in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of my, let me list my buckets. I'm going to grab one of my temporary buckets. Maybe I'll use the remove me again. And I'll create a scenario where I'm going to run this flow with the bucket key input set to remove me bucket, one of my specific buckets that I have registered. I can save the scenario. I can create additional scenarios where maybe I would run the same flow with different sets of inputs as well. But for now, this one scenario is all I need. Now, when I say run, I can actually pick which scenario. So I can say, I want to run scenario number 1, which is going to run this flow with my specific hard-coded bucket name, right? Now we can see we can follow the flow. So the first call to list object succeeded, and it returned the body with no next field because I don't have additional pages, probably just like you, and just one item in the items list, which is the test RVT file that we uploaded during part 1 of today's webinar. So we extract the items and the next fields, feed them into our condition. We find out, okay, there is no next page. So we actually don't run any of this flow at all. And we immediately jump into the default output, sending out just the results with the one item. And that is our or my test RVT file. Okay, that's pretty much the flow. The complete flow. One more thing, again, we want to do so that we can use this module in the final flow in the part 4 of our webinar today is we need to create a snapshot, a specific version of the state of this visual diagram in time. So we're going to create a new snapshot and we're done. Okay. All right. So let me see. There's maybe a question there. I don't see the second variable bucket key in the list objects. Any idea why? Camille, that might be because, again, if you take a look at the list objects requests, you maybe you don't use a variable here. Because I think when we imported the OpenAPI specs, this request had some hard-coded bucket name as an example, but we don't want that. We want to use a variable here. So, go back to your list objects request, and under the params section, make sure that you're actually specifying a variable. So use the double curly braces, something like bucket key, let's say in this case. Um, that will make sure that the bucket key will appear as an input on the list objects block. All right. All right, and when does today's course end? Andy, we have, so this is basically all for part three, and we still have the final one, part four, where we build the final flow that will actually iterate through all your blocks, oh sorry, all your buckets, and it will calculate the total size of objects in the individual buckets to generate this bar chart for you. That's the missing piece. But this is actually it for the part three. It's been pretty quick. So I would say actually example flow. So I would say, let me create a poll, but now let me add a new option in the poll that would be to actually continue straight away. Duplicate, edit, no break. And you guys let me know if you want to take a break before jumping to the final part, or if you want to continue straight ahead. My guess is that it'll be a no break because, yeah, this has been a pretty quick part. All right. In the meantime, let me take a look at the Q&A again. I'm seeing APS client secret and client ID as a variable, but no bucket key option. David, yeah. So this is one step we took during the first part, I think that maybe you missed. So what we did is originally we took the list objects request. And here there was some weird string. There was something like S123, like some hard-coded bucket name. What I did is I deleted that original string and instead I typed in curly bracket, bucket key, which basically said, which in with that I basically said I want to use a variable for this input. And then Postman told me, okay, but there is no such variable called bucket key. And let me actually see if I can do that here. Maybe I could say, what would be a good example? Get object details. So here, let's say I'm going to grab this other request as an example. See? So I'm looking at the parameters, and the parameters are hard-coded here in some weird way. What I did is I said, no, I don't want to hard code any text here. Instead, I want to use some kind of a variable. And I used the opening double curly brackets, and I said, earlier I said bucket key, but now I can come up with any other variable name. I can say foobar and closing curly brackets. Now it's colored red, and Postman is telling me, hey, you are trying to use some variable here, but I don't recognize this variable. I don't see it defined anywhere. I don't see it defined at the collection level. I don't see it defined in the environment. I don't see it defined at the global level either. So what I did is I hovered this new variable and I used this add to dropdown to decide where this variable should be at least defined. So I said collection, right? And I kept it as, kept it like that. So now what this means is that when I go back to my collection object storage service and I look at the variables, I have a variable defined here called foobar. There's no value for it, but that's fine. We have defined a variable. Just like before, I defined a variable called bucket key. Now I added another variable called foobar. And that means that whenever I would want to use this particular request in my flows, this foobar would appear as an input of the block, right? And the reason you don't see the bucket key input on the block is probably because, again, um, you haven't specified the bucket key variable in the list objects request. All right, and one more. Under list objects failed, but I see the bucket key now. Okay, but you're saying that when calling the list object, it actually failed. So when you see that, try and click the fail output, and that should tell you why it failed. I'm not sure if that could be an authentication issue or maybe a wrong bucket. Maybe you haven't specified the input correctly. So Camille, try and take a look. When you click the fail parentheses, just like here, I can click the success and I will see the output of the success um, response. You should be able to see the response from the failure as well, hopefully giving you some more ideas, some indications as to why the listing objects failed. Running your flow. With status code. So Michael, I see 401 means authorization. So make sure that in list objects, you don't have any custom authentication set up here. When you look at the list object request under the authorization section, you should always see inherit from parent because we earlier configured authorization at the collection level. So we want to inherit that. Okay, because it's possible in your case it's doing something slightly different. Maybe you're not sending in the correct token, and that's when you would typically get back this 401 code, which means you're not authorized to make this call. All right, okay, so let me end the poll. So it looks like people do want to continue, which I think it makes sense. So let's do that. All right. So final part 4 of our webinar. Now what we'll do is we will build the actual flow that will iterate through all of your buckets registered by your application. And for each bucket, it will retrieve all objects because we now have the 2 modules that can do that for us. And it will basically calculate the total of the object sizes for each bucket and output it as a bar chart. So you will see on the x-axis, you will see all your buckets. And on the y-axis, the bar height will actually be the total number of bytes used by all the objects in the individual buckets. Okay. So in our tutorial, we're now moving to part 4. We'll create a new flow. And again, we're going to start using the flow modules we built in the previous parts. Got an output. Oh, perfect. Okay. Let me go back to flows. Say, I can use the new button, let's say at the top in Postman. I can say create a new flow. All right. Okay. And again, just like before, we see a blank canvas where we can start combining our blocks and API calls or modules and chain them together. So I'm going to say add a block this time. I'm going to select flow module, right? This is, again, we want to start reusing modules that we built earlier. And here, hopefully, you should see 2 modules. List buckets and list objects. Those are the ones we created earlier. And again, if you don't see them here, make sure that you created the snapshots of those modules, right? Otherwise, they won't appear in this list unless you have at least one snapshot available. So I'm going to say list buckets. So see, now we have one single block, which actually internally represents the entire flow we built earlier that iterates through all the pages of buckets in case you have multiple pages. Okay. And when done, do you remember the output block we added to the flow? We named it all buckets. So when this one block completes running internally, all those loops, looping through all the pages, it will output an array of buckets out of this output, all buckets. Okay. Um, all right. Now what we want to do is we want to loop over every single bucket returned by this list. So this is the first time we're going to be actually using the for loop or for block in Postman. So what we want to do is create a new block. and use the for. Okay, so what this does is whatever blocks you chain after the for loop will be called for every individual item from the input list. So in my case, I have 23 buckets, right? So this block will presumably output a list of 23 entries, and this for block will output 23 individual objects representing the individual buckets returned by my module here. All right. Now, what we want to do is we will want to, for each bucket, we want to list all its objects so that we can calculate the total of their sizes. So for each item, for each bucket, we will call another module, and this time that will be list objects. And again, remember when we created the list objects flow, we specified a required input, because if we want to get a list of objects, we need to know for which bucket, right? That's why we specify the bucket key input in the start block, and that's why it appears here as an input as well. So what we need to do is we need to provide the actual bucket for which we want to list the objects. So what we can do is we can take the item, every single item coming out of our for block, right, which we know will be an object with fields like bucket key, data retention policy, and stuff like that, or created time. Actually, I think we can probably even skip this connection because I believe the run trigger is only needed if you are not specifying any additional inputs. You just want to start the block without any input values. But since we do provide an input here, every time a new object arrives to this input, this will trigger another execution of the list objects flow module. So I think we actually don't need to use the connect the run input. All right. Now, again, important thing is the objects that will be arriving to our input will be JSONs that will have bucket key, policy key, and some other fields. But when we want to list the objects, we only want the input we expect is just a string with the name of our bucket, right? So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to just type in manually bucket key. I mean, I could run the flow up until here and then, let it explore what are the outputs on the item output here, what are the values. But I know for now, I know that there's going to be objects with a field called bucket key, which is the name of the bucket that we're interested in. Okay, so we know, so this list objects module in my case will be executed 23 times for each of the buckets that I have access to. All right. Next thing we want to do is we want to calculate the total size, the total number of bytes of all the objects for each bucket. So what we want to do is we want to take the output from our list objects block and connect it into an evaluate block, because here again we need to use a little bit of TypeScript to compute the total size used by the individual objects. So I'm going to create a new evaluate block out of the all objects output. All right. So here I can call it, I'm going to call it, what am I going to call it? Let's see again, I want to make sure I'm consistent with the tutorial. So I'm going to call it objects. And we need one more input, and that is the actual bucket name or bucket. And we can do that by grabbing the output from the for loop and dragging it into, let's say like this, dragging it into our evaluate block. And we can call this a bucket. So right now, what's happening is, again, we will get a list of buckets, and we're going to feed the list into a for loop, which will trigger anything after it separately for each entry in the list. So in my case, 23 times. And for each of the buckets in the list, we will get the list of objects. And we will then feed them into this evaluate block to sum up their byte sizes, basically. So what we can do here is we can define an expression, which are whatever expression we want to be emitted by the output of the evaluate block. So in this case, this will be a JSON object, and we can say bucket key. We will output a JSON with a field called bucket key, and it's going to be bucket dot. Oh, the IntelliSense is getting in the way. So basically, we're going to take the input called bucket, which is coming directly from our for block. So this will be the JSON object representing an individual bucket. So it will have fields like, again, bucket key, policy key, or creation date. And we want to output a second field so that some number that we can later plot in a bar chart. So we're going to call this one total size. And in here, we want to basically calculate, because we have all the objects coming into our evaluate block. So what we need to do is take all these objects, the list of objects, find their size numbers, and sum them up. And we can do that in TypeScript using this following expression, the reduce method that's available for JavaScript, for arrays in JavaScript. You can say sum obj. This is kind of like your reduce method takes the running total and then the individual object from the list, from the input list, and then it should return the updated running total. So in our case, that would be sum plus obj size. And also you need to provide the initial value for your running total, in our case, a sum. So that would be 0. So let me copy and paste this in the chat. Right, so this is a TypeScript expression that, again, will, for every bucket, it will create a JSON object that will have a field called bucket key, which will be the name of the bucket. And it will have a field called total size, where we will basically sum together, the sizes of the individual objects, right? So again, objects will be a list of JSON objects describing individual OSS objects in our bucket, and they will all have a field called size, which is their byte size. And we can explore that later after when we run this flow. Okay. Now, again, keep in mind, these blocks, the list objects as well as the evaluate, in my case, will all run 23 times, once for each bucket in my original list of buckets. So in order to take these 23 iterations, block executions, and combine them back into a list, which is what we want to do in this case, you want to use a block called collect. So this is the collect block is sort of like the counterpart of the for block. So for block gets a list and it executes whatever blocks after it individually for each entry from the list. And then finally, you add the collect block, and that will take all the individual results from the evaluate block in this case, and it will combine them into a list again. Okay, so let me bring the collect block here to the left. And finally, this will be our list, which ideally should contain 23 objects looking like this, with the bucket key and with the total size, in my case. In your case, depending on the number of your buckets, it might look different, of course. And with that, we can already send this data into a display block and set it to bar chart, because simply doing this, simply feeding a list of objects into the display block that have some name and some number, the display block is smart enough to figure out, okay, so I see objects where each object has a string and a value. So I'm going to use the string for the x-axis for the category, and I'm going to use the number for the height of the bar chart. I believe this should be it. Let me see if I haven't missed anything. Oh, let me run it. I mean, if there's any issue, we can debug it. All right. So we're getting a list of buckets. Now we've got them. Now we're listing objects for every individual bucket key. So now this is running like 23 times. And let's see. So it's still going. See, so basically the output from my for loop is every single bucket from my 23 buckets. So for each one, I'm running my list objects. So for a specific bucket key on the input, I'm generating some number of objects on the output because in some buckets, I may have a large number of objects. So it's still running. And once I've iterated through all my buckets and calculated their totals, there we go. The output, yeah. And there we go. So we've gone through all my 23 buckets. For each one, we called the flow module to list all buckets, oh, sorry, list all objects in that specific bucket. We used a little bit of TypeScript to sum up the sizes of the objects, or in other words, the files in my bucket. And here you can see the input to the collect block were the individual results, right? So some bucket key with some total size. And then the collect block basically waited until the full array was exhausted, and then it output all the results as a single list. So now I have, let me zoom in. Now the output from my collect block was this 23 results, where each one was an object with some key and some totals and the total size. Right? So I fed these 23 entries to the display block and I set it to bar chart. And now I can very nicely see which of my buckets have the largest number of, sorry, the largest um, um, byte size. All right, so there is an error. Sum is not defined. Sum is an argument to the function we're passing to the reduce function. Or you know what? I'm kind of thinking, how about this? Let's do it simpler. Let's say we want to change this so that we're not calculating the total file size, but let's say just the number of objects in individual bucket. How about that? That might be simpler. So we can replace this and say objects.length, right? So we're still doing the same. Everything else is still exactly the same, but as we're evaluating the individual buckets, and we can even change this to be a bucket name. It's just a name we chose for our object. Total count, right? So what we do in the evaluate block for each bucket is we output a JSON object that will have the name of the bucket and the total number of objects. So not necessarily file size. That was just the idea we had for the tutorial, but I mean, we could show just the length, right? So it will output a field called bucket name and a total count, which will be just the length. There's a number of objects in the bucket. So let me try and run this one more time. So again, we're listing all my buckets, and now we're listing the buckets for my individual buckets. See, so we're basically executing this 23 times. And when that's ready, and for each of one of the iterations, we're generating new output from the evaluate block. And once we've gone through all 23, once all the 23 results have been fed into the collect block, then we will see the results in the display. So it's still going. Size. Daniel, I'll show you. I'll show you where you can find the different fields that are available on your objects or buckets. You can just use the API requests to just, see what data you get back in the response. All right, and we're done. So there's a simplified version, and you can see that many of my buckets are pretty much empty, and we can even see it when we take a look at the output from the collect block. So you can see that, in my IoT extensions demo, I only have one object. I have one object, and in my debug persisted, I have 43 objects, 0 in debug temporary, da 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 da. So the largest number of objects I have in my bucket called Peterbras-samples, I have 353 objects there. Right, so again, somebody could say it's kind of boring, very, simple workflow, but I think this is just to showcase the type of automations that you can build, right? So whenever, let's say you wanted to build some tool that will generate some dashboard, some analytics about the status of your data in OSS, let's say, you could either code it yourself, manually calling these APIs and for loops, or you can build, this kind of visual diagram and use that. And then potentially, have other people, your colleagues who may not be developers, tweaking these flows and generating different kinds of data, different kinds of analytics. Okay, so that's it for our flow, for our webinar today. So let me just quickly take a look at some of the pending questions in case there are any. So again, finding out what kinds of fields are available on the, let's say, buckets or objects. The easiest would be, go back to your collections, and if you list buckets, you will see that by default, the data you get on the output is things like a bucket key, creation date, and policy key. That's it, right? And this is the API request we're using in our module, so you know that these are the fields you can work with in your flows. And similarly, if you try and, let's say, list your objects for a specific bucket, you will see that currently I only have one object there. And for the individual objects, you get things like object key, which is really the file name of your design sitting in the bucket. You get the size, which is a number, the size in bytes, and some hashes, and like a full location URL. Okay, so this is the data you get from when you're listing objects. You can get more. There's other endpoints that give you more information. So let's say, for example, here, instead of listing buckets, maybe I want to get details of one specific bucket. So there is a separate API for that. It's called get bucket details. And here I can, once again, because I know I already defined the bucket key variable, I can just use it here and get the details. So if I get the details of my bucket, I get a little bit more data other than just the key and the creation date. I also get permissions, meaning that, if I add more client IDs that have access that I want to have access to this bucket, I would see them here in the permissions list. I also see who the owner is of this bucket, and that this is my client ID in this case. So different APIs may give you different amount of details about the individual entities, right? But the standard list buckets or list objects, they just give you the name and the policy key, like the basic information. All right. Or again, what you can do is also, I think you can put like breakpoints on the individual blocks, right? So if I select, let's say, the for block, there's also this menu that appears on top of it that you can use to like group things, duplicate, or change colors, or pause. So you can say pause on this block, right? Um, and so what this means is that when I run the flow, it will collect all my buckets, but then it will actually stop here, right? So I can, for now, I can just select the for block, see what inputs arrived to my for block. And I see that the input is a list of 23 items where each item has certain fields. That's so from now I could say, okay, so I know that for every item from this list that I feed to my block here, I know that every object will have bucket key, created date, and policy key, right? And then I can let, or I can stop it, or I can let it proceed, let the flow proceed. So that's another way to find out what are the fields that are available on your bucket or object JSON records. Um, now, there's a question, how do I extract the bucket created date? So the bucket created, that's you get it in the, what's it called? I think, is it the Unix epoch time? So when I list buckets, I just get the created date, which is, yeah, the Unix epoch, I think. And let me see, I think you should be able to create a date out of that. Um, let me see what would be a good example. Maybe if we go back to the list buckets, items, results. Let me see. I'm trying to think what would be the easiest. I mean, I think we could probably use the evaluate block. So maybe let's do it here. And how about using something like this? Bucket. And what was it called again? Was it called created dates? Yeah. So maybe something like this. And this is not, I mean, I haven't tried this, but I'm thinking this might work, right? So we take the Unix epoch time and we create a new date object. So the results we're generating and displaying um, will now have three fields: the name of the bucket, the total count of objects, and the date the bucket was created. And we can try and find out if this will work. Maybe if we turn this into a table. Okay, let me try. And again, this is unscripted, but let's see what this says. Output. Yeah, there you go. So see, so we're now basically outputting from the for loop, we're outputting results that include the name of the bucket, the total number of objects, and now the bucket created as well. So by using this new date TypeScript expression, we're turning the Unix time back into a date object, which is then, I mean, stringified, put back to string. All right. So we can let it run. And in the meantime, let me see. Objects length are the number of objects in that bucket. Maltesh, that's exactly right. So objects in this evaluate block, objects is simply an input, which is an array. And in JavaScript or TypeScript, arrays have a property called length that so you can just say my array.length that will return the number of items in the array, right? So that's what we're doing here. We're basically just getting the length of the array with all the objects to get their number. All right, and we finished. So now you'll see we have our table where we see every bucket with its creation time. So you see some of my buckets were created back in 2020. And if we look where's the one I created today? Low code, no code. See, so the low code, no code bucket I created today has 0 objects in it. Okay, so there you go. So there's your creation time as well. Okay, and say one more question. Can we use this to iterate through objects in a model in ACC and search for and view specific objects in a model in ACC? Yes, Eric, you could. Again, like we could maybe cover that as a separate tutorial, but that would require three-legged authentication, right? So in our case, since we're using the simple object storage service, we just use standard what we call two-legged authentication. If you wanted to access your data in ACC, you would need to use three-legged authentication because you would first need to log in with your Autodesk credentials to generate a three-legged token. And that token could then be used to get access to any files you may have in your ACC projects. And then you could also, what you could do is you could use the same three-legged token to find a specific file, let's say, in your project, and then use something like the model derivative service in our platform to get information of about the properties within that specific design file, right? So you could do that as well. I think we had some examples on this in the past where we had a similar version of this flow where we basically, but I think that was still two-legged. But we basically we iterated through all objects in a specific bucket. And for each design file in that bucket, we used the model derivative service to retrieve the properties from within that design file. So, and any kind of 3D elements with their, material, volume, or other type of dimensions, we extracted that info and we were displaying it in a table or a chart as well. I can try and see if I can find the I don't know if that was recorded. Um, that was from last year's AU, I believe. So I can try and take a look offline and see if that's available. It was presented, it was me and Jaime, my colleague, my former colleague. We had a talk there that was showing this. All right. So this is it. This is our, let me see if I turn this back into a bar chart. Yeah, it is still smart enough to understand that if there's three fields in every object, one is a string, um, one is a number, and another one is a date, um, then, or actually a string as well, then it picks the number for the y-axis. All right, that is it for our webinar today. Let me see, go back to my slides, see if we have anything left. I think it's just basically the outro of our session today. So tomorrow we have another webinar, another session planned, this time for Power Automate. And on Thursday, we will have our colleagues from Autodesk. This is not going to be us developer advocates, but our colleagues from the Connect team presenting ACC Connect, which is yet another option for you to build automations using low code, no code platforms specifically suited for ACC. Okay. After the event, again, as we mentioned, our program manager will be sending out an email with information such as probably the most important one, the links to YouTube with the recordings of our sessions. And we also have some recommendations here. Let me maybe share these with you. Let me see. Accelerators. We have this accelerator program where we invite customers to join us with an idea. Whenever you have an idea for a new prototype, new solution that would be built on top of our platform, or some feature you would like to implement into your existing solutions, we run these events called accelerators. These are very popular. Um, these are basically week-long events where you can join us typically in one of our offices or in a co-working space for a week with your idea. You can hack on your ideas, and we are there to basically answer your questions immediately should you have any, right? So if you get stuck on anything or you want some recommendations on like what the best practices are for implementing a certain thing, you don't need to go online, send us an email, schedule a Zoom call with us. You you can just turn around and ask one of us, and we're there to help. So definitely recommend if you already have some ideas, something you would like to build on top of Autodesk Platform Services. We've already announced some dates for accelerators all the way through April next year. We also have lightning talks. Let me see, lightning talks. These are like very short videos on some niche topics that we also that you might find helpful. Lightning talks and our blog. This is also something where we typically post to provide recommendations or suggestions on some very specific questions. Like whenever we see like lots of people asking about the same kind of specific thing, how to do something very specific, let's say with our viewer, we write a blog post to document that. So blog post also very, very helpful. And you'll find links to all of these, the accelerators and the lightning talks and blogs and many other things from our developer portal from aps.autodesk.com. Okay. Again, Stack Overflow, we're still active there, even though Stack Overflow itself is sort of becoming less and less relevant with the dawn of AI, but we're still there. If you have any questions that you want to discuss with the community. And yeah, we also have our official help channel that you can access through the developer portal. Okay. I believe that is it. We have some more online training scheduled. November this year will be another training, this time dedicated to ACC APIs, right? So today, this week, we're focusing on low code, no code. No, in November, the online training will focus on the use of the Autodesk Construction Cloud APIs. Okay, we're on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and again, you will get the links from our program manager later. And you can also subscribe for a newsletter from our developer portal if you want to stay up to date and stay informed of any updates, any good news on our side. And that is it, even for my slides. So with that, let me take a quick look at the Q&A or the chat. Question from Eric, do we have to do this in the US storage or can we also do this in EU? You can absolutely modify your flows to work with other regions as well. So again, going back to the basics, if I want to list my buckets, the region parameter is optional, but I could also specify it. I could say I want to list all my buckets only in a specific region. So now you can see, now since I specified region EMEA, I only see one bucket because I only have one bucket created in the EMEA region. If I don't specify the region, we basically assume US by default, and that's where I have the majority of my buckets created. And now then going back to your flows, you could also, you could turn this into an input, right? So let's say you wanted to have this flow that is listing buckets. Maybe you want to make it, parametric, and you want to let the users of the flow select which region they want to list the objects in. So maybe what we could do is we could say, you need to specify a region, right? And now we need to somehow feed the region into my list buckets. Right now, I can't do that. But you remember what I can do is I can just come back here, enable the region query parameter. And instead of hard coding a value, I'm going to say curly bracket, region, curly bracket, curly bracket. And I can define a new variable, let's say at the collection level, just like the rest. And now if I go back to my flow, see, I can actually send the region that was the input for my flow into the list buckets. But now here I'm kind of wondering, here I'm not entirely sure if we need to specify the region for the next page as well, or whether that picks it up automatically. That I need to try. But this is basically all you should need for having your bucket listing flow module parametric, meaning that you can specify, list all my buckets in EMEA only, or list all my buckets in US. So here, let's try that. If I run this now, it won't let me, right? It says you need to create a scenario. So let me try a scenario. I'm going to call it list EMEA buckets. And if we run it, it succeeded. But this time, see, I only got one item in the array and no next field. So we just extracted the list of buckets, no next field. So we immediately hit the default condition branch. No looping needed. There you go. See, we just basically got all the buckets, like just one bucket here in EMEA. So you can exactly, you can make it parametric, and you can you could add another parameter, which could be like a page size, right? Like the default is like 10 items per page. You could have another one. It could be size, that could be a number, right? Or maybe I'm kind of wondering, maybe what would be kind of cool, but this is already just like just having fun. But you could have another field called created after, which could be a datetime, right? And then as you're listing your buckets, you could insert a maybe here you could insert a filter where you would say, only include buckets that were created after this input field, right? So any kind of filtering you would want to, no, again, you can go crazy, you can go as fancy as you want. All right. So with that, let me stop sharing and stop recording. And